Our story begins with the thought that if hell truly exists, it is now right in front of your eyes. The man who is wounded calls the young man in front of him Majesty Birun. As we can see, he is in a state of shock. Still incredulous about the situation, he calls for the young man named Kiri as the latter affirms that this is all he can do. Then Birun becomes furious, ordering him not to give up. He wants Kiri to take up his sword and fight again at all costs. But at this moment, it was already too late. His great and loyal friend had just lost his life on the battlefield. Birun continues to reject the current state of things. He deeply mourns the fall of his friend. Then, slowly, he took his friend's sword. Furious, he screamed desperately as a massive aura emerged from his body. All of this took place in a country created by dragons and humans called Kairos. Kairos had demanded the treasure from his homeland called Sakrisha. The treasure was called the Axis of Time, as he mercilessly eliminated his enemies. He thought they had been right to refuse Kairos' offer. While lost in thought, someone cast a spell on his back. Looking at the caster, he realized it was too late. Then he lost his hand in that attack. This was the beginning of a war. Still enraged, the man held his sword firmly with the hand that remained. This was the war that would mark the end of his country. And this was the great king of Sakrisha, Birun Sakrisha. Suddenly, another mage began casting a spell while chanting glory to Kairos. The magic aimed at him was immense, and he could already smell death. However, his thought was to never give up. He could never let them stop him. Meanwhile, the magic was getting closer and closer to Birun. He slashed through it while shouting that he was the sword of Sakrisha. At that moment, several people approached. These were the mage troops of Kairos, the strongest mages known as the Balkans. The one who orchestrated all of this was the mad king of Kairos named Planche. Furious, he thought these people had turned his country into a true hell. One of the mages started approaching. He introduced himself, saying his name was Arson, the commander of the Balkan troops. Now face to face with the enemy, he questioned his opponent's name. But as Birun prepared to attack, he said he had forgotten everything. Charging quickly for the attack, he exclaimed that he was just a sword that served the king. His opponent only laughed, mocking the situation. While casting an ice spell, he said he would remember him, attacking with full force and saying he would remember the king of Sakrisha. Birun fell to the ground after the blow, and his vision blurred. At that moment, he saw his entire life flash before his eyes, the destruction of his beloved country, and the moment when all the light vanished. As the sunlight reached his eyes, someone said he needed to wake up, calling him prince. Two vassals in front of him questioned if he had had good dreams. They also said he needed to hurry because Prince Planche had already left. The person who was now waking up did not understand why Planche's name was being mentioned. His last memory was that his arm had been struck, and of course, the vassal did not understand what he meant by that. Saying that he had an arm, divorced, from his body left everyone around perplexed and made them question if he had had a nightmare. Quickly, the vassal asked if he was alright, but at that moment, he could only think about why someone was mentioning the name of someone he deeply hated. He wondered how his arms were regenerated since he had never seen such a regeneration. As memories that didn't belong to him invaded his mind, he asked the vassal who he was. And when the vassal responded that he was Kallian Lane Kairos, he was stunned. This was because he had reincarnated on the enemy's side, in the body of the third prince of Kairos. With trembling hands and frightened, he questioned his name. In his thoughts, he remembered the people who had attacked him, and wondered what had happened to him. Quickly, he asked the vassals what today's date was, and they replied, April 28th. He questioned again to know what year it was, and the vassal said it was the year 522 and asked if something was wrong with the prince. Terrified and sweating profusely, he thought that what was happening had no chance. He had woken up a decade before the last war. The war had started when a strange object that had the power to turn back time suddenly appeared in the palace. It was the Axis of Time. The news spread quickly, and the ruler of the Kairos continent also began to covet the object. A man questions what he meant by Kairos demanding that the Axis of Time be handed over. They were strong, but the object belonged to them. They could not hand over such a dangerous object to an enemy nation, regardless of the cost. Thus, they rejected Kairos' request immediately, and the war began quickly as if they had been waiting for it. The man begs Birun not to go to war, saying that everyone who went is dead, and he cannot afford to lose the rest of him. That day, Chase Hyungnam must have witnessed Birun's death. The man, crying out, calls for his friend and says that if he could return to a time before that object appeared. He becomes too intrigued by his thoughts to understand what is happening. The vassals are frightened by his sudden agitation and ask where the prince is going. Quickly, he opens the window, wondering if by chance Chase Hyungnam used the Axis of Time to go back in time. Looking out of the window, trying to grasp something, the thought comes to his mind that this might be his last chance to prevent the fall of Sakrisha. The vassal interrupts his thoughts, saying that he understands the difficulty in attending breakfast but that it could not be delayed any longer. The prince then apologizes for making him wait, and says he will get ready now. In his mind, he says that if he's going to make the most of this opportunity, he will live as a prince of Kairos. The doors open, and someone announces that Kalyan, the third prince, is coming to have his meal now. Then he enters the room where someone is already seated at the table. The vassal, embarrassed, apologizes for the delay and says he should have hurried a bit more. Seated at the table, drinking his coffee, is Randall Sale Kairos, the first prince. The three princes of Kairos were all half-brothers and belonged to the lineage of the sacred state of Tensel. By order of the king, breakfast was prepared for the three princes every morning, but as for the memories in Birun's mind, he will always be. Birun, now as Kalyan, apologizes for the delay, and Randall continues his coffee as if he doesn't even exist. Sitting in his chair, he remains incredulous at being ignored so blatantly, ready to have his coffee, thinking that only one brother is missing to complete the group. At that very moment, Planche, the second prince, enters before even being announced to have his meal. He sits down casually in his chair. Kalyan is shocked by his appearance, not wearing formal attire, and in his mind wonders which member of royalty in the world goes around in that state. His astonishment makes him question if this is truly the Mad King he knows. Meanwhile, a vassal serves coffee to Planche. Judging the Mad King's behavior, Kalyan starts to think that this title might have a different meaning. He turns his attention to Randall and remembers that the first prince cannot mess with the second prince. The current queen of Kairos is Planche's biological mother, and no one within the royal palace would dare to challenge her authority. He continues drinking his coffee, wondering how he will survive in a place like this. Then Planche notices the third prince drinking his coffee, and calls him reckless, which shocks Kalyan. He turns his gaze to the second prince, who is now looking at him. Planche then says he doesn't have a drop of decency. After all, he takes after his mother. Kalyan becomes angry and starts grinding his teeth in rage. He slams his cup back on the table angrily, thinking he must endure this because he can't lose the chance he's been given. All the images of the war flash back into his mind, and he continues to feel the growing anger towards Planche. Kalyan, with an enraged look, feels the urge to finish off the Mad King right there. Then Planche looks at him with a menacing gaze. A cup falls to the ground, shattering and making a mess. It was Planche who threw it on the ground, and raged at Kalyan. Then, standing up, he glares at Kalyan with great fury and asks how he dared look at him like that. Randall quickly taps his cup on the plate, drawing both of their attention. Planche immediately looks at him with a surprised expression, and then turns his gaze of disdain back to Kalyan, who appears frightened by the situation. Planche begins scratching his head in anger, and quickly, knocking over his chair, says that he is leaving the room. Turning his back to the two princes, he says he's lost his appetite because of that filthy red-eyed brat. Shocked by everything that just happened, Kalyan looks at the first prince to see his reaction. However, he only tells him to behave. Randall says that their majesty's birthday is approaching and asks if he intends to cause a scene so close to such a special day. Kalyan, still shaken by the entire situation, doesn't say a word. He only wonders if this situation is truly his fault and not Planche's. Then a servant asks if he is alright or if he is hurt. He quickly begins cleaning the prince's feet, which were dirted by the broken cup, and says that not a day passes without something happening. As the servant cleans him, Kalyan thinks that at least he has a loyal servant who cares for him as if it were his own body. Despite everything, Kalyan stands up and places his hand on his servant's shoulder, thanking him for taking care of him. The servant is startled by such an action. The servant then looks at him with a surprised expression, thinking that normally the prince would have just cried in silence. But when he looks at the prince's face, he sees that he is smiling. The first queen of Kairos, Dragon Sisphanian, had black hair like the night sky and eyes like sacred flames. Kalyan was the only prince to have inherited her traits, but the powers he had were lamentable. Kalyan always tried to hide his red eyes. Looking at his eyes in the mirror, he thinks, since Planche hates my eyes. At that moment, Planche walks behind Kalyan and says, "Disgusting eyes like blood." In his mind, there are still memories of the prince before he awoke in this body, and it makes him a little uncomfortable. Looking up at the sky, wondering why Kalyan was afraid to show his eyes to someone like Planche, he calls him an idiot under his breath. The servant nearby asks if something is wrong or if he wanted anything, and the prince says no, that they will go back now. Surprised by his actions, the servant says he's acting strange today and asks if he read a novel about a gentleman, to which the prince replies no. The third prince was born of a peasant concubine. He was afraid of many things, had no one to support him, and was so weak that he couldn't even defend himself. Shortly before the coming-of-age ceremony, Kalyan, who was heading back to his quarters, tells the servant to wait. He turns to the servant and asks his age, and without understanding why, the servant says he will be 15 in 4 months. Kalyan is startled, remembering that Kalyan was murdered before his birthday. He had tried to poison Queen Celise and failed, then hung himself out of fear of punishment. That's what the public heard, he thought. but no one believed it was true. Sweating profusely, he concludes that someone will come for him soon. The door opens very quickly, and he moves even faster. Some servant calls out to him, but he keeps walking towards the window, and the servant tells him to slow down. In his mind, he only thinks that he has 1 or 2 months before Kalian's death, and since he doesn't know what happened to his original body, he needs to do something. The servant warns the prince that if he falls, but before finishing his sentence, he is interrupted by the prince asking for scissors. The servant, shocked by the unusual request and not understanding much, goes to fetch the scissors. The servant hands the scissors to the prince, still somewhat confused. After the prince takes the scissors, the servant asks why he needed them. Then, moving the scissors toward his hair, the prince says it's to change a few things. As he cuts his hair, he thinks that if there's a predetermined future, he will twist it. All the servants in the room are very alarmed, asking what he is doing and saying that Prince Planche won't like it. Then he replies that he can't live like a fool forever just because Planche dislikes certain things about him. He tells everyone to calm down and says not to worry about it. Then, with a look of conviction, he says he will handle it. They head to breakfast, and at that moment, Prince Planche enters, surprised, and asks if he has lost his mind to have done that. The servant is extremely startled by the arrival of the prince, and wonders if this is what Kalian meant when he said he would handle the situation. Planche, sitting down casually at the table, says, "Hey, Red Eyes," but before he can finish his sentence, the prince interrupts him, saying, "Kalian," while sipping his water. He then looks at Planche with a slight smile, and says that his name is Kalian. The second prince, with a tone of irony, says he really should call him that as he gently picks up a knife. Then, suddenly, Planche shouts that he should call him by his name as he throws the knife. Everyone is shocked by this, and they see the knife heading towards Kalian's servant. Then the prince calmly observes the situation with a very tranquil expression. The knife hits someone, and drops of blood fall to the floor. It was Kalian's blood, as he had caught the knife mid-flight, cutting his hand slightly. The servants, in a panic, shout at the sight of the wound. Kalian keeps staring at Planche while the servants scream that the prince had hurt his hand. Then Planche, with a mocking tone, says that his hand must have slipped. Ironically, he comments that Kalian's hand is injured. Kalian smiles and quickly stands up, placing the knife next to Planche, saying he's fine. Planche looks at him with a surprised expression, as those actions were very unusual. The prince says it didn't hurt him much and leaves the room, returning to his quarters to treat his hand. His servant suggests calling a healer, but he says it's not necessary. Kalian shows his bandage and says it was just a small cut. The servant, still a bit frightened, tries to argue, but is interrupted by Kalian calling his name. He asks why the servant didn't dodge Planche's attack. The prince continues questioning the servant, saying that he knew the attack was aimed at him, and what he would have done if the prince hadn't blocked it. Then the scene of the incident flashes through his mind, and he says he should be capable of avoiding such an attack. The servant replies that if he had dodged, Planche might have used it as an excuse to harm the prince. Kalian then stands up and goes to the bathroom, saying that because of what happened, his heart is racing and he'll calm down after washing his face. The servant tries to insist that he help the prince, but Kalian responds that he will do it himself and not to call a healer. Crying, the servant wonders why he can't call a healer. Inside, Baron begins to think that earlier he was almost subconsciously using aura during Planche's attack, but he felt a sudden pain in his heart. Then, confidently, he thinks he should try it again, to confirm Kalian's body's condition, focusing on releasing his aura. Quickly, he starts to release his aura, but then he feels something different in his heart. There are 3 mana circles near his heart. He is astonished by what happened and by what he felt. And with that, the question crosses his mind, was Kalian a mage? The sunlight streaming through the window illuminates the young prince's room. Inside, sweating nervously, Kalian tries to brush it off, and the servant says it has been 3 days already. Then he shouts that his injuries haven't changed at all and that he should do something, but the prince insists he's fine. With a slightly trembling voice, the servant tries to say something but is interrupted by a man in red clothing. The man introduces himself as Sutton Slake, the royal tailor, and Baron asks what's wrong. He bows his head, already apologizing, and mentions Freya. Quickly, the servant interrupts the tailor. The man apologizes for bringing up her name, and Baron thinks he's tired of the reactions after cutting his hair. Kalian had suffered for a long time for resembling his mother and began to hate seeing his face, to the point of breaking all the mirrors. So, without giving much importance, Baron says it's fine and that he knows he looks like her, telling the tailor to do what he came to do. The tailor begins taking Baron's measurements, and while measuring, he says the prince should eat more because he's very thin. Baron then says he's eating well. The tailor, afraid of contradicting him, agrees. Looking at himself in the mirror, he thinks that this ends up making others worry. The royal family of Kairos is descended from dragons, and to be exact, they are descendants of 2 of the 8 heroes who sealed the evil god. Those were the hero Hakura and the heroine Sisphanian. Sisfanian gave the royal lineage of Kairos the power of healing and magical abilities, known as the Blessing of Sisfanian. In other words, Kallian's injuries should have healed long ago, but it hadn't, Baron thought. While the tailor measured him, he kept thinking that every time he used mana, he felt pain in his heart. He was worried because if it continued like this, he wouldn't be able to use mana and would die when the assassin came. The tailor finished his measurements. The tailor said he would prepare some clothes for His Highness to wear for the king's birthday, but Baron was only wondering if anyone there knew anything about mana. But something quickly caught his attention. It was the king's upcoming birthday. Baron grew anxious because the king would be there, and he is the great mage Elon Manisil, whom Baron was eager to meet. Elon Manisil is one of the 3 out of 4 traveling merchants who are 7th circle mages and the idol of all magicians. In the past, Elon was invited to the king's birthday and visited Kairos, and stories tell how a certain incident led to him being turned away when he arrived at the gates of Secretia. Elon, who couldn't attend the festivities, was elevated to a great mage of the 8th circle after 10 years and proved his abilities. Baron, sitting in his room, thinks that only Elon has enough knowledge of mana to help him. Looking out the window, he reflects that, due to the certain incident, Kairos doesn't treat mages well, so perhaps Elon won't agree to his request. The reason why countless knights travel across the kingdom of Kairos is due to the influence of Planche's mother's family, the Bresson family. So Baron thinks that if he can bring Elon to his side, maybe he can stop the war that Planche will start. Then the movement in his room catches his attention. It was the tailor and his assistants, deciding on Baron's outfit and whether to add ribbons and lace to the prince's clothes. Shaking his head, he says he doesn't want ribbons or lace. The servant is astonished, and Baron asks if he thinks he would look good in lace. The day begins with the sun shining through the window and birds singing in the trees while Baron drinks his tea. He finishes his tea while thinking he's getting somewhat used to this life. His hand is almost healed, and Planche has been outwardly ignoring him ever since. Then his servant tells him that in the morning he has a horse riding lesson, and at 7 in the evening, he has plans for dinner with the Queen and Viscount Bresson. Baron, not understanding why, asks if the dinner is with Viscount Bresson, and the servant says yes, it's because of the king's birthday. Thoughtful, he reflects that he would eventually have to deal with the Viscount. The servant asks if he will also train his endurance today. While putting on his clothes, Baron says that training is just running by the lake beside the palace. Leaving his room with a smile on his face, he says not to worry and asks what could happen. Baron arrives at the training field and begins his exercises. He appears out of breath and very sweaty, thinking he's going to die. Then his trainer, who is right behind him, notices and calls out in alarm. Startled, she asks if he's alright and says his stamina is declining. She is the daughter of the 2nd commander of the outer defense. Leaning against the tree, out of breath, Baron hears the trainer say that with each passing day, he's running fewer laps. Sweating heavily, he thinks that he's really been working out and that his stamina is indeed decreasing. Something must be wrong. Then she says that if it's too difficult, they should call a healer. But he replies that it's not necessary, that he's fine. He knew that if they called a healer, the mana circles would be exposed immediately. Even his servant doesn't know that Kallian is a mage, so if he acts recklessly, his life will be at risk. Baron says that his stamina simply failed, and a healer wouldn't help, and the young trainer tries to argue. But he insists he's fine and that he'll get better over time. Then they hear distant shouts instructing them not to look away and to observe the enemy's movements. Baron and the trainer quickly look in the direction of the shouting. It was the knights' training, which had just begun. Then a man in the center of the knights yells for them to train hard so they don't die on the battlefield. While all the knights bravely train, Baron watches them closely. It reminds him of the old days. His trainer says this is the Pable Knights training ground. Baron says he knows and that he was watching because it's interesting. She's surprised, asks if he's never engaged with swords. He says he's just now developed an interest, and she asks if he knows what kind of place the Pable Knights are. He replies that yes, they are the knights of the Bresson family, who keep the king's power in check. Someone approaches the two and asks who he is. It was Commander Pable, who says if he has no business there, he should leave. He adds that the knights are bothered by being watched, and that he can't train properly. Then Baron looks around and sees that all the knights are glaring at him with anger. The young trainer shouts, telling Pable to show respect because he is Kallian, the 3rd prince. Pable, with a tone of disdain, says he hadn't recognized him. With a mocking smile, he says that he thought it was a bastard rat secretly watching. Then Baron gives a wicked smile, looking at the commander. The young trainer steps in front of him, shouting at the commander, asking how he dares to say something so reckless in front of His Highness. The commander then says he almost made a mistake and asks why she's being so sensitive, as the prince isn't all that important. Pable turns his gaze to the prince and is shocked by what he sees. The prince was completely different, behaving in a much more intimidating manner. He remembers a past moment when he shouted at the prince to get out of his way because he was leaving. The prince, intimidated, clung to the wall, apologizing to the commander. He thought that Kolyan was weak and timid, but now he seems different. The prince appears braver and more empowered, with a firm gaze. Pabel feels a much stronger presence emanating from the prince, which makes him uneasy. Then Baron says he has a question for the commander. With a look of anger, he asks Pabel what his duty is. The commander, terrified and sweating nervously, is scared of the young prince. Then two knights approach the commander, asking if something is wrong. They see the prince and wonder what he's doing there, as even the knights look down on the third prince. The commander then says they are in the middle of training, so he can't respond and tells him to carry on with his task. Baron, standing firmly, continues while his trainer is shocked by the prince's behavior. He bravely repeats the question to the commander. What is his duty? Everyone is frightened by how the prince is behaving, as it's not typical of him. The commander notices his knights whispering and feels embarrassed by the situation. Pabel responds that his duty is to strengthen the forces of the royal family and protect the royal family and the kingdom. Picking up a branch from a tree, Baron says that's exactly what he should be doing. He quickly breaks the branch, holding it firmly, and he concludes that the commander is a failure in both of the duties he just mentioned. Furious, Pabel asks what the prince is talking about. Baron replies that if the commander is supposed to strengthen the royal forces, his training looks like a mess. Holding the branch in his hand, Baron swiftly moves to attack. Leaping behind Pabel, he's ready to strike the commander. Pabel, frightened, thinks he must defend himself from the attack at all costs. He already predicted that if the attack landed, he would die. Quickly, he grabs his sword, drawing it from its sheath. He manages to block Baron's attack at the last second. The commander is terrified by what the young prince was capable of doing with just a tree branch. Baron continues to press against Pabel's sword. With a smile on his face, he releases the branch that was against the commander's sword, causing Pabel to lose control of the sword, which flies far away from them. Baron then turns his back and says he's disappointed in Pabel for not being able to predict the movements of someone who has never wielded a sword. The commander, still in shock, doesn't know what happened or how the prince moved so quickly. The prince then says that the protector of the royal family and the kingdom calls the prince derogatory names and wounds him with a sword. Looking straight at the commander, he asks if that should be considered treason. The commander, in shock, wonders if this is truly the third prince he knows. Then he kneels before the prince, apologizing, saying he wasn't thinking clearly. All his knights, frightened by the situation, listen to Pabel begging for forgiveness, saying he had no intention of committing treason. As he finishes, asking the prince to forgive him, Baron just looks at him with disdain. Still kneeling before the prince, with his face toward the ground, Pabel thinks that he will never forget this humiliation from the third prince. Yen, Baron's servant, with a surprised expression, asks why someone who went to train endurance shows up with a horse, concludes the servant as Baron holds a black horse by the reins, smiling happily. He hands the reins to his servant, saying he picked it up on the way and that its name is Raven. Yen asks where he's been. After all the commotion between the prince and the commander calmed down, Baron spotted a horse and asked what was going on with that horse. The horse was resisting the knight's commands because no one could tame it. The horse was indeed very wild and strong. Then the prince had an idea, as that horse belonged to Planche. His servant was shocked that he brought Planche's horse on his own. The prince then says that Planche mentioned anyone could use it, and whispers to his trainer to keep what happened with Pabel a secret. With a trembling voice, Yen is afraid that the second prince will find out, but Baron reassures him that it's fine if something happens. Baron then feels a sharp pain in his chest again, which startles both servants. With his hand on his chest, he thinks he has pushed this body too far. His servant asks if the endurance training might be too much for him, but the prince says no, that he simply had some fun with someone afterward. Someone was hiding, observing the three of them, and quickly left to avoid being noticed as Baron told Yen to head to the dinner. In a gazebo in the garden, someone sitting receives information from another person. Holding a flower in his hand, he says that even worms squirm when they are stepped on. Then he crushes the flower forcefully and says that no matter how much someone like him tries to squirm, they can't change their origins. Throwing the flower to the ground, he says it wouldn't be fun to just press and kill, and that for now, they will just watch. And once again, the three princes are gathered for another meal. Baron thinks he still can't get used to the atmosphere, even though he's there every day. Prince Planche seems different than usual. With a thoughtful expression, Baron notices and wonders why he looks so down today. As he sips his wine, he wonders if the Queen and the Viscount are late because of him, and notes that Planche is unable to hide his emotions. Then the dining room door opens suddenly. Everyone rises from their chairs and turns their gaze toward the door, and Baron smells something that reminds him of something. He becomes very happy to see who enters the dining room. Wearing a stunning green dress and with baby blue hair, it was the Queen. The true power behind this kingdom, Celise Brisson, the second queen and current queen of Kairos. After the previous queen passed away from illness, Celise rose to this position, using the power of her family to control the royal knights. Most of the nobles also supported the Brisson family, and so her power grew stronger every day. As a result, the third prince, Cullion, became a nobody, even to a mere commander. The Viscount, who enters with the queen, tells her how they will handle Pable, and she confirms, saying they will provide him with proper compensation. Sitting at the table, she tells him not to report such trivial matters in the future, and he responds that he understands. Looking at Baron, she asks why she has to concern herself with such insignificant things. He only looks at her with a serious and cold expression. Everyone at the table remains silent, simply observing what is about to unfold. The queen then addresses the third prince, and he turns his gaze toward her. She says that he has grown quite a bit recently. He gives a slight smile, which surprises her, as this was an unexpected reaction from him. Holding his wine glass, he responds that he hasn't grown that much yet. He finishes with a smile, saying that he will certainly grow much more in the future. The other two princes are astonished by his response. The queen looks at him with a hint of anger at that reply. The Viscount then enthusiastically says that it doesn't matter how much he has grown. As he speaks, Planche glances at Baron angrily out of the corner of his eye. The queen, Planche's mother, whispers to him, asking why he didn't tell her about it, and he asks what she's referring to. She says it's about his horse not obeying his commands. Planche didn't understand what his mother was talking about. When it clicked, he turned his face away, embarrassed by what had happened. She then says it would have been better if he had told her earlier, and he replies that she already knew. Planche grips his fork in frustration as the queen says that he never mentioned the horse wasn't obeying him. He then bangs the fork on the table, saying it was a useless horse from the beginning. He stands up from his chair and says he's leaving first. His mother, the queen, is startled by his behavior and calls out his name. 3 weeks pass, and the date of the king's birthday has arrived. All the servants are focused, ensuring nothing goes wrong with the celebration. Several horses arrive, loaded with gifts for the king. Everyone is expecting the banquet to be lavish. The people of the kingdom wonder if the princes are already getting dressed for the celebration, and everyone is excited. Meanwhile, the tailor is checking the measurements he had previously taken of the third prince. He notices that the measurements are different from before and wonders why. As he is about to ask Baron if he has been eating properly, he is interrupted by a drop of blood falling to the floor. Looking at the prince's face, he is shocked by what he sees. The prince was bleeding heavily from his nose and appeared very startled by what was happening. Immediately, all the servants rushed to help the prince, who was bleeding. His servant shouts for another to bring a cloth while the prince says it's not that bad. He explains that it's because he hasn't been sleeping well lately, but Yen insists that's not the real issue. The tailor interrupts, saying that the bleeding isn't the only problem. He points out that the young prince has also lost weight in recent days, and the weight loss is noticeable on his body. The bleeding begins to slow, and Baron knows he has been losing weight lately. With a smile on his face, trying to ease their concerns, he says that he has been exercising a lot over the past few days. Baron starts reflecting that he has been working hard, but his stamina is only getting worse. It always hurts a lot when he uses mana. He suspects there must be something wrong with Callion's heart. The tailor, frustrated, says that this isn't something he should take lightly and asks if he has had a checkup, to which Baron replies that it's not necessary. He wonders why he had to have a nosebleed in front of so many people. The tailor tries to argue with the prince, but Baron firmly says that he's fine. Yen then says that he can't just dismiss this so easily and that the cause of the bleeding is because he's been picking his nose. He continues, saying it must have been difficult to admit such a personal hobby to everyone. Baron is stunned by what his servant is saying as the other servants whisper among themselves. Yen concludes, saying that the prince has been eating and exercising well, so the bleeding must be due to his hobby. The tailor agrees since Yen knows the prince better than they do. Then Yen looks at the prince with a smile and winks at him, leaving Baron still confused. The prince then recalls the day when Yen was worried about his condition, and he had told him that he could use magic and that his issue was related to mana. The prince, feeling a bit foolish, wonders if Yen has decided to ruin his image like this, but he is relieved since his servant managed to come up with an excuse to get them out of that situation. The tailor then says he will adjust the clothes as he had mentioned earlier. He seems a bit hesitant since there's not much time, but Yen reassures him that the prince has other things to do first, so there will be enough time. The tailor leaves, happy that he will have time to complete his tasks, while Yen whispers to the prince, calling him. He nervously asks Baron if it's happening today. Baron becomes thoughtful, as he is anxious about what is to come. He knows he needs to meet the Magellan. No matter the state of his health, it will become known throughout the palace. So before that, he must meet the Magellan at any cost. The time for lunch arrives, and they head to the dining area, but they are informed that, due to an urgent matter, lunch has been cancelled. Instead, they are told they will meet everyone one by one. The prince is surprised by the sudden change and wonders how they will have time to meet each person individually. Wouldn't it be more efficient to meet them all at once? Baron wonders but follows closely behind the butler. They arrive at the first room, and Baron is a bit nervous because he wasn't expecting a private meeting. The door then opens, and someone tells the prince to enter, as His Majesty is waiting for him. He steps into the room and sees a man sitting on the sofa, reading a newspaper. It was the King of Kairos, Romain Laroon Kairos, who remains engrossed in his reading. The third prince bows, greeting His Majesty. After that, he slowly straightens up, seeking eye contact with the king. But something leaves him both shocked and surprised. The king didn't pay the slightest attention to his presence and continued reading his newspaper. Baron thinks that while he hasn't always been strictly faithful to Kairos etiquette, he is aware that this behavior is rude. The king finally invites him to sit. The prince congratulates the king on his 38th birthday, and the king asks how he has been. Still focused on the newspaper, the king remarks that the prince seems to be in good health, which surprises Baron. The prince recalls all of his servants being worried about his health. He thought that even the attendants passing by knew that he had quickly emancipated himself. The prince understood why the king wanted to meet with them one by one, even though there wasn't much time. If he met with all three of his children at once, he would have to focus on the conversation, so seeing them one at a time was easier. Because, to him, spending time with his children wanting to congratulate him was a waste of time. Baron found the customs of this family strange, having a father who didn't care about his children, a first prince who was indifferent to everything that happened, and a second prince with no etiquette, who reeked of alcohol and treated his servants terribly. While Baron was concluding his thoughts, someone entered the dining room. The king, with a tone of annoyance, said she was late. It was the queen who had just arrived, and with a mocking tone, she said it simply happened. As the queen entered with a sarcastic smile, Baron concluded that she had enough power to disregard the king. He then smiled to himself, thinking that there was someone among them trying to kill him. While a servant shouted that the event was about to begin, Baron tried to figure out who would send someone to kill him. As the prince appeared before the people, someone commented to another that he was completely transformed. Compared to him, the second prince, Planche, seemed completely drunk. The ones commenting on this were the queen and the king. She concluded that it wouldn't change anything, and people were just making noise about it. While sipping his wine, the king said that something was different, that unlike before, something had changed. Then the third prince was announced, and he entered the hall, drawing everyone's attention, leaving everyone stunned by what they saw. So the rumors were true, thought the people present. The prince with black hair and red eyes, reminiscent of Sisphanian. The prince's new appearance caught everyone's attention, especially the fact that he had cut the bangs that used to cover his face. He was also wearing a bright red brooch that enhanced the color of his eyes. It was, therefore, a statement that he would no longer hide. The prince smiled happily while everyone took notice of his outfit. Then his servant Yen whispered in his ear, asking why everyone was staring. All eyes were on the third prince. Yen finished his question, wondering why everyone was looking at his clothes. Then he said he knew the reason, and the prince looked at him, waiting for him to speak. The servant, very pleased, asked if it was because he looked handsome and said that Seton would be happy to see him like this. The prince was surprised by Yan's remark. Baron then said that they were staring because of the jewels he was wearing, and as he explained, he remembered how difficult it had been for the tailor. He told Yen to be happy that it stopped there, as it could have been much worse if he had worn everything, but Yen said he looked great. As they walked through the hall, Baron asked if Yan's family was in Kairos, the capital of Kairos, and Yen was surprised that he remembered that. His servant then said that his younger sister and father had returned to their hometown, but the rest of his family still lived in Kairos. The prince asked if they would come to the royal palace. Yen replied that they would if they received an invitation. The prince stopped and looked at him. Trying to change the subject, Yen asked when he should have Raven waiting in the garden, and Baron realized that he didn't want to answer the question. There must be things he prefers not to say, thought the prince. He responded to Yen's question, saying they would wait for the right moment. The prince mentioned that there was someone he wanted to see, which surprised his servant. Baron asked if Yen knew why this hall was called Siegfried, and Yen replied that of course he knew. It was named in honor of the first patriarch and one of the heroes of the war, Duke Quitros Han Siegfried. The only ducal family in Kairos, the Siegfrieds, despite holding great power, had remained loyal to the royal family for over 500 years with a steadfast commitment to defending Sisphanian's territory. Baron recalled how impressed he was when he heard this story while in Baron, and Yen asked if the person he wanted to see was, before he could finish the question, answered yes it was. At that moment, a loud laugh caught their attention, and a man said that Siegfried's summer night was always a classic. Yen then told the prince that he was right there. It was Duke Slayman Han Siegfried, a very elegant man with a clean-shaven beard, long hair, and a broad smile. Baron felt pleased because he admired families with long-standing loyalty. He began to subtly release his magic to test how sharp the Duke was. Slayman quickly noticed the use of magic in the area. He turned his gaze directly toward the third prince. Making eye contact with Baron, he realized the magic was coming from him. Baron stopped releasing his magic, satisfied that Slayman had detected it instantly, even though he had released only a little of his power. Yen then said that the Duke was showing interest in the prince. The prince knew that Slayman was one of the 5 master swordsmen on the continent, and there was no way he wouldn't notice. He remarked that it was still too early for this. He asked Yen to act as if they hadn't noticed Slayman's gaze, turning and walking out of sight. Slayman continued watching them as they left, knowing the power had come from the young prince. Shortly after, the king made a toast, thanking everyone for their congratulations and telling them to enjoy the night in Kairos. Baron and Yen then slipped out of the window using a rope they had prepared earlier and made their way to the garden. There stood Planche's unruly horse, waiting for the third prince. But under Baron's commands, the horse was calm and gentle, even earning praise from the prince, though Yen warned him not to be fooled. However, seeing how the horse behaved in Baron's presence, Yen admitted the horse seemed intelligent. His servant asked if they should head to the main gate, and the prince replied that for now, no one could enter without an invitation. As they neared the gate, they noticed a commotion among the guards and a visitor insisting that he had traveled a long way. Even so, he was told he couldn't enter and was politely asked to leave. Baron observed the scene and was surprised because he recognized the visitor. The visitor asked the guard if he was being denied entry because he didn't have an invitation. He was Elon Manisil. All the guards were shocked when they realized who the man on the horse was. They became fearful and whispered among themselves. Then one of the guards said that even though Elon claimed to be who he was, he still needed an invitation. Elon smiled beneath his hood. He remarked that it was a pity that Kairos differentiated the status of its guests based on appearance. Confronting the guard, Baron, listening from a distance, was shocked by the mage's words. He thought that it truly was a problem to judge people based on how they dressed. But he also realized that Elon wasn't just criticizing for the sake of it. It seemed like he was trying to find an excuse not to enter Kairos. Elon then turned his horse around, saying he would return soon. Baron watched the mage leave and thought he couldn't miss this opportunity. His servant, almost as if reading his mind, said they couldn't leave. The king's orders forbade anyone from leaving during the festival. As Elon slowly rode away from Kairos, Baron realized that if things continued like this, they would lose him quickly. He told Yen to do whatever it took to delay the guards while he rode swiftly toward the gate. As he distanced himself from Yen, who tried calling out to his prince, Baron only urged the horse to go faster. The guards at the gate shouted for the prince to stop his horse immediately. They continued to tell him that leaving was forbidden by the king's orders. With great skill, the prince's horse leapt over the soldiers and continued quickly toward the exit. The guards were left stunned by the situation and the horse's speed. Shouting into the wind, the guards announced that the prince had left Kairos. They rushed to fetch their horses to follow the prince immediately. Yen, still shocked by everything, didn't know how to help the prince in this situation. He remembered the prince's order to do whatever it took to delay the guards. He then motivated himself internally, declaring that he was Prince Kalian's attendant, and that his duty was to protect the prince at all costs. In a bold act, he shouted for all the guards to stop immediately. He claimed that Duke Siegfried had granted permission for Kalian to leave, but one of the guards retorted, asking who he was to use the duke's name like that. Untying his hair, he revealed, "I am Saroyan Siegfried." With his hair blowing in the wind, he declared himself the eldest son of Duke Siegfried. Some time passed, and loud laughter could be heard. Yen, or rather Saroyan, sat looking embarrassed while someone next to him laughed heartily. Still blushing with embarrassment, Saroyan said it wasn't something to be proud of. He then called out to his father, who, still laughing, admitted he couldn't believe his son had done something so clever. Playfully, like a father teasing a child, the Duke says that his son has gone off to raise a little one. The Duke then adds that Yen made a good decision, but Yen replies that it wasn't, saying that His Highness might ruin his relationship with the king. Yen's father tells him that he won't ask about what happened. Yen is surprised by this response and his father's calmness, who repeats that he won't ask anything about what transpired. Romain thinks too much. If the boy has Siegfried's help, it will put him in a cautious position regarding our assistance. If there's a relationship where he gets help but faces no punishment, it would be the same as acknowledging a friendly relationship between our family and the prince. And Breeson will criticize this if it happens. All of this will probably be buried as if nothing happened, concludes Duke Siegfried. Meanwhile, the prince is still pursuing the mage Elon, and is nearly catching up with him near a fountain. Elon senses his presence, and says it doesn't seem like the prince is here to scold him for not having an invitation. He asks why the third prince of Kairos is following an old man like him. Baron recalls having heard that upon reaching the seventh circle, a mage's aging process reverses. It seems that was indeed true. The prince then remarks that it's already quite late and asks if Elon is simply planning to leave. Elon responds, saying that when he tried to open a closed door, it seemed the threshold was still too high. Baron didn't understand what he meant by that, whether it was a subtle hint or not, but knew he couldn't do anything for Elon. So he says that Elon went to a closed door when another one was opened for him and asks where the invitation for criticism was placed. Face to face with Elon, Baron says he was blocking the wind and forgot to clean the dirt off the threshold and didn't expect the guard's mistake. The mage was astonished by the way he spoke, wondering if the prince was honest or just shameless. Elon smiled slightly and thought the prince was quite amusing. Looking at the prince, he remembered that when he first saw him, he didn't have the gaze of a 14-year-old boy, and he noticed something in his hand. Elon noticed something different about the prince that caught his attention instantly. He called the prince, who was waiting for him to finish speaking. Then, suddenly, Elon asked for a moment's pardon and grabbed his hand, pulling it closer. Baron didn't know what was happening and tried to ask what he was doing, but Elon began using his magic to try to activate the magic in Kalian's body. This caused Baron to feel the familiar pain in his heart that he always experienced when using magic. Elon's mana was flowing into Kalian's body, which caused Kalian's mana to repel Elon's, creating a small explosion that pushed them apart. The horses backed away from each other in fright, and Baron was still in great pain in his heart. Elon then said that even with closed doors, the wind cannot be completely blocked. Baron realized that Elon had already noticed the state of his body. He repeated Elon's words, asking, "The wind cannot be blocked?" Baron admitted that Elon was right to some extent, as he couldn't use mana. Elon thought to himself that the problem wasn't the mana and wondered if the prince truly didn't know why he couldn't use it. Looking at the prince's hand, he concluded, if he doesn't know that the real issue lies elsewhere. Then the mage looked intently at Baron as he clenched his fist. The Kairos family mistreats mages despite being descendants of dragons. The great mage had come on his own, intending to make fools of them. But now here he was, in a meeting with the young prince who had followed him to this place. Elon pondered. He then asked why the prince wanted to see him. Baron, still catching his breath from everything that had happened so quickly, began to speak. But he knew that if he lied, the mage would catch on. So he started speaking sincerely to Elon. Baron dismounted his horse, saying that he wanted Elon's name. As he slowly approached the mage, he said that he believed his life would be in danger soon. The prince concluded, "I'm not unaware of the third prince's situation." Elon thought as he watched the prince speak. This prince, who is simply hated by everyone. A prince surrounded by enemies. Then a spell was cast around the two of them, which startled Baron with its speed as Elon leaped from his horse. It was a silent spell, Baron thought, still astonished at the mage's ability to cast magic without uttering a word. Elon then asked the prince what his true goal was. "Do you simply want to prevent this from happening?" Elon asked the prince. "Or are you trying to eliminate the true cause?" he questioned again. The prince responded, saying that for now, he was only trying to prevent it from happening. Elon was surprised by the young prince's answer, who continued by saying that he genuinely wanted to eliminate the source of the problem. He concluded his response by saying that if he needed to take the throne to achieve his goal, then so be it. Elon, with a disbelieving smile, thought that the throne was merely a tool for achieving his objective, while he himself was a prince dying. The prince who resembled Sisphanian needed his help to reach his goal, Elon concluded. The mage found all of this very interesting, and became quite excited. Then the mage asked for an invitation once again, and told the prince to show what he had. Without hesitation, the prince knelt before the mage. He introduced himself, saying his name was Kalian Rain Kairos, and saluted his new mentor. Elon Manisil accepted the invitation from His Highness. Looking at the young prince kneeling before him, Elon thought to himself that he would save his life. We return to Yen, who is speaking with his father, asking if he was sure that people didn't know who he was. The Duke replied, saying that he had taken care of it and that Yen didn't need to worry. Yen said that if he had been recognized, he couldn't have stayed there. As the Duke continued talking about Yen's identity, the young man recalled something. Then, feeling a bit anxious, he asked about someone named Leah. He asked if she was doing well, which caught his father's attention, causing him to stop speaking immediately. He responded that she was doing very well in her position as the head of the lower family that Yen had abandoned. The Duke stood up, stretching, and said that if Yen wanted to return, he would be welcome at any time. Sighing, he added that he didn't think they'd see each other for quite some time. Yen, with his head down, asked what he was talking about since they would see each other again in 3 months. The Duke was taken aback by his son's comment, and asked if he was really thinking about giving up his position as the prince's servant. Yen remained deep in thought, still with his head down. He responded, saying that he would soon turn 15. His father was surprised by his response, and just looked at him. Then he called his son, who looked at him attentively, and asked if he knew the nickname of the Siegfried family. Yen responded that he did. Before he could finish his answer, his father said he was right. With a smile on his face, he said they were known as the elephants of Kairos. For a long time, they never vied for the throne. But they knew they were very powerful, and they were called the king of beasts, untouchable even by other creatures, the Duke concluded. With a thoughtful look, he asked why Yen suddenly had, but he was interrupted by his father hugging him tightly, saying that their name carried great strength. Still embracing his son, he told him to do whatever he wanted to do. Yen grabbed his father's arm, overjoyed by the words he had just heard. Then his father began lightly choking him, calling him a rascal for making him worry, while Yen begged him to stop because it hurt. They continued playing together as father and son under the beautiful night sky. Yen composed himself again to play the role of a servant, and called his father Duke Siegfried. The Duke questioned why he was calling him that, and ordered him to disappear immediately. Yen then bowed before his father, and said he would see him next time. The Duke watched him leave from the bench where he sat, and remarked that this nonsensical stubbornness of his only confirmed that he was indeed a Siegfried. He then recalled the moments inside the hall when the prince had released his magic, and he wondered when the prince had grown so much. Gazing up at the night sky with the beautiful full moon, he pondered what the prince was truly planning to do. The next day dawned beautifully, with a blue sky like the sea, filled with clouds as horses approached. A carriage entered, and the people were in disbelief at what they saw. Could it really be that crest? 7 red flowers and a silver cane were the symbols on the crest. A lady told a man that she had heard his contract with Reberin had ended, and the man asked how he was now in Kairos. "Isn't it an obvious decision, considering what he's been through?" the woman asked. "If it weren't for the king, he would have left already." The woman asked if it was because of the rumor they had heard earlier, and the man inquired if it was true about Elon Manisil's son. As the man spoke, someone descended from the carriage. It was Elon Manisil, dressed in black and white, with his hair down. He got out and smiled, thinking that his new disciple had done something quite charming for him. He recalled the young prince's request for him to arrive exactly at 9:30. He had also been told that he would need to pass through the open door at that time. Elon wondered if His Highness was trying to compete with the Brisson family, and if so, it wouldn't be an easy task. Baron was waiting for the moment to introduce the mage to the nobles and shake things up. Then a man approached, expressing surprise at the sudden visit from the mage Manisil. It was a group of servants, and they informed Elon that His Highness had been expecting the mage's arrival. While having tea with someone, the man inquired about what was said. It was the king who was having tea with the mage, questioning him because Elon had asked for a place to stay. The king asked again to confirm if the mage really wanted a place to stay in Kairos. Elon, very calmly, replied that he did, as he needed a place to stay in Kairos. The king then pondered the mage's sudden request. He had been thinking that in order to compete with Celise, he would need a power like that of Elon Manisil. But the king hadn't expected the mage to offer this first. He then tried to figure out what Elon was planning. As Elon drank his tea, he mentioned that the previous night, in the square, he had seen a black cat with red eyes, leaving the king somewhat confused. The mage continued, saying that the cat was intelligent, so he thought about teaching him something, but he had no place to stay, which surprised the king. The king asked what Elon wanted to teach the cat. Elon replied that he wanted to teach the cat magic, of course. And not just that, but he also wanted to create an environment the cat would enjoy. If he wanted to do this, he would need to help the homeowner, and also tidy up the house. The king was astonished, realizing that Elon seemed to know everything that was going on. He asked if Elon was capable of handling all of this. Elon knew that by accepting Kolien as his disciple, Brisson wouldn't be able to interfere, and he could help His Highness without being hindered. He told the king that all of these thoughts were the true invitation from Prince Kolien. The king slammed his hand on his leg and quickly stood up, saying he would arrange a place for Elon to stay. With a smile, Elon thought to himself that the house was already a mess, so nothing could make it worse. The king then said he was curious for one reason because he had heard that the boy wasn't anything special. Elon asked, "Not special?" and thought to himself that even Kalian's health condition was unnecessarily special. It had reached the point where it was difficult to find anything normal about him. The king continued, saying he had heard the boy had many fears, even a fear of horses, yet still went after him. The mage was surprised that the king was speaking only of things he had heard from others, and the king added that if the boy were special, he would have known. Elon interrupted the king to ask a question. "Do you perhaps not know the prince's condition?" asked the mage. He continued, questioning whether the king knew how high the princess stood. The king looked at the mage seriously, and Elon had his answer. The king knew nothing about the princess. Elon said that sometimes attention can be a poison, and indifference can be a remedy. But he knew well that being busy was just an excuse, the mage concluded. The king was shocked by what he had just heard and by the mage's boldness. He said he would consider Elon's attitude of not knowing his place as a sign of concern as Kalian's mentor. As he walked toward the door, the king remarked that it was absurd to have to explain this, but he valued the princes greatly, especially Kalian, who was precious to him, he added, as he held the door handle. He began to say it was best to end this conversation, but before he could finish, Elon snapped his fingers. Then the silence spell was cast around them, startling the king. Elon grabbed the king's attention, telling him to stop stalling. The king asked what he was doing and how he was able to use magic in the royal palace. Elon began explaining things about Kulyan. His lips were dry, he was short of breath, and his skin had a bluish tint. His nails appeared purplish underneath. His clothes were clearly adjusted in a rush, and considering they were ready a month ago, he must have lost a lot of weight. He tried to stand but was unable to lift his body. With his eyes closed, he felt dizzy. The king was shocked by the many facts that Elon was stating. Elon continued, saying that if the king remained just a spectator, he would lose everything. A maid approached Yen, who was standing by the prince's door. She mentioned that it was almost lunchtime and that the prince hadn't had his morning tea yet. So he took the tea from her and said he would be careful in case the prince coughed. He entered the room and saw that the prince was still asleep in his bed. The prince appeared very tired and looked very thin. Yen thought to himself that the previous day had been a bit hard on him. As Yen was about to wake the prince, Elon suddenly appeared behind him, asking if the prince hadn't woken up yet. Yen then realized the mage's presence, and at first, he didn't understand what had happened. But then, startled, he threw the tea tray up in the air, scolding the mage for appearing out of nowhere. He asked how Lord Manisil could act like that, and Elon replied by saying he had heard that strangers weren't allowed in the palace without permission. "So you teleported because you didn't have permission?" Yen asked, to which the mage responded that it was a rift, much more difficult, and he was very skilled in magic. Yen, regaining his composure, told him to leave because the prince's health wasn't. Before he could finish his sentence, Elon stepped closer, asking if he didn't recognize him. Elon said that Yen had come to Rebrin a few years ago. "Did you think I wouldn't recognize you just because you've grown?" Elon asked, and he called him Baby Elephant, which left Yen very surprised. He remembered that his father had said no one would suspect him of being his son. With a shocked expression, Yen thought to himself that he had been caught, and quite quickly, too. The prince then woke up in the middle of their conversation and asked how long he had slept. Before answering, Yen informed the prince that he had a guest. The prince asked who it was as he sat up and spotted Elon in his room, calling him teacher. Elon then handed the prince a small red pouch containing something inside. The prince untied the knot to open it and asked what it was. He poured some small balls into his hand while Elon told him to eat one a day, without forgetting. Baron asked if it was medicine, and Elon told him that right now, he was facing two problems. The first was that the prince couldn't control his mana, and the second was that his body was losing weight rapidly. The prince remarked that even without saying anything, Elon could perfectly understand what was happening to him. Elon asked if the prince had the power of the blessing, and the prince confirmed, saying that it gave him the ability to heal and an affinity for magic. Baron recalled that, despite this, even his healing power seemed to have disappeared, remembering when he injured his hand. He asked Elon if there might be a problem with his heart. Elon, now serious, asked if he had ever thought of it as a strange combination, which left the prince deep in thought. Baron said that he had wondered if the power of the blessing had strengthened his heart, as the origin of both mana and life resides in the heart. Elon confirmed his question, saying that the blessing's power indeed strengthens the heart. Then, with a serious expression, he said that his blessing's power hadn't disappeared, his heart hadn't failed, and his mana wasn't blocked. Curious, the prince asked what it was then, and Elon questioned if he had never thought about it. "What if the blessing of Sisfanian hasn't disappeared but is being used to its limits somewhere else?" asked Elon. The young prince was surprised by Elon's words and thought that the blessing's power was being affected, to the point where he couldn't even heal small wounds. Then, frightened, he asked Elon if it could be some kind of poison in his body. "If it weren't for the blessing, you'd already be dead," the mage replied. The prince, terrified by all of this, listened as Elon explained that curing such deadly poisons puts a lot of strain on his body, and his healing power was at its limit. Moreover, he had tried to use mana in that state. Because of this, his heart had rejected the attempt. Baron reflected on what was happening with this body. Originally, Kulyan had been assassinated, but he had already been poisoned before Baron possessed his body. It wasn't something planned right before it happened, thought Baron. Angrily, he wondered, why did they have to hang a child who was going to die anyway? Elon noticed the rage that the young prince was feeling. He thought, this isn't the kind of bloodlust a 14-year-old should have. What is he really? As Elon finished his thought, Baron said, "This must be the antidote," while holding one of the pills from the pouch. The mage confirmed, saying it was made in haste but he was sure it would work. As Baron held the pill, he looked at Elon with a curious expression and asked, "What if I told you I would take the poison and the antidote together?" Holding the pill up high, Elon was surprised by the young prince's question. He responded, "Even if you take the antidote, if you take the poison as well, it will only delay the effects. To which Burin replied, "That's enough." Elon, astonished by his answer, asked if he truly planned to take both and if he already knew who was responsible. Burin said he had a clue. He explained that he suspected the source of the poisoning was the tea he drank every morning, as he drank it in front of everyone, and no one else drank tea with him. Could Cullion have noticed what was happening to his body and rejected the tea? Perhaps that's why he was assassinated. Burin thought. He knew the situation had changed after he possessed that body, so he wasn't sure what methods might be used next to eliminate him. He told Elon that until he figured out the method, he needed to keep everything secret. The mage questioned if that was truly the only reason. Burin said that if he revealed the morning tea as the problem, Yen and the other servants would be at risk, and that wasn't something he wanted. The culprit had been doing this regularly, so they were confident they wouldn't be caught, said the prince. Sighing, Elon remarked, "The baby elephant will be fine." Burin didn't understand what he meant, but the mage just told him to forget it. Elon said that, in any case, he understood Burin's situation, and he asked what Burin planned to do next. In his memories, Burin recalled a man calling him a fool, and telling him that to take someone's trump card, you first had to offer something of your own. "In times like these, I think of you, father," he concluded his thought. He then asked Elon to escort him out of the palace the following morning. The day began with someone shouting, calling for Prince Planche and asking him to wake up. As the door burst open, someone entered the prince's room very quickly. His servants tried to wake the prince, but were soon ordered out by the person who had entered the room. She yanked the canopy off Prince Planche's bed in one swift motion. It was the queen, saying, "It's already late for you to be preparing for the afternoon schedule, don't you think?" She finished questioning him. Planche sat up in his bed, shirtless, looking exhausted. The queen was taken aback by the strong smell of alcohol. She asked him if he still couldn't pull himself together despite being forbidden from drinking at the square ceremony. Calmly, Planche picked up the glass of water beside his bed and asked why she was there. He told her to just answer and leave, which made the queen so angry that she bit her lip. She said that apparently, Cullion had decided to take on a mentor, the seventh circle mage, Elon Manisil. As Planche finished drinking his water, she added that the aristocrats were already wavering. The second prince, showing no interest, asked what that had to do with him. The queen then approached Planche abruptly, her eyes furious, and told him that all the resources invested in him had better not be wasted. She ordered him to get ready immediately. "There will be many eyes watching you today," the queen told Planche. "So you'd better not disappoint me," she said, leaving the prince's room. Planche was furious with everything that had happened. He threw the glass in his hand onto the floor. His servants were startled and said that he was bleeding. Drops of blood fell to the floor, and Planche told them to leave. Shouting angrily, he ordered everyone to get out immediately. In his mind, he pictured Callion's smiling face with those red eyes. The second prince was seething with rage at the situation. The royal family parades through the kingdom while the king is cheered by the people. They congratulate him as he waves with a gesture of gratitude. The queen, inside the carriage, only observes the euphoric crowd. Right behind come the three elegant princes on their horses. The child on his father's shoulder is happy to see all the princes there. His father comments that the one coming far behind is the one he wanted to see the most. It was Prince Cullion, wearing his red outfit that highlighted the beauty of his eyes. Callion's servant, who was leading his horse, calls him to ask a question. With a worried look, he asks how his body is today. Continuing, he says it's a relief that his appearance is much better than yesterday. The prince, smiling, says it's because he rested a lot. He thinks that it might be because he took an antidote the day before, and the pain in his heart has greatly diminished. The servant said there are many plans for today: a parade, horseback riding, and then a ball. Cullion then replies that he worries too much, that he feels better and can handle all matters just fine. A hooded man is seen hiding in the middle of the crowd, hidden in an alley. The prince saw what the man looked like, and something caught his attention. He then tries to recognize who those people are, because he hadn't seen them there before. Recalling the war that had killed him, he remembers the man who saved his life in the war that once killed him. It was the same man standing in the alley ahead of him. He is extremely shocked and wonders if that is really Kairi. Then the prince is certain that it is Kairi. The horse also notices his presence in the area. Baron wondered what he was doing in Karis. The horse then tries to move towards where Kairi was, but the prince's servant holds it by the reins so it doesn't leave the street. The protagonist then orders him to move forward. As the hooded men turn their backs to leave, the servant wonders if there was something there. Baron just watches the men leave. He gently strokes his horse in an attempt to calm it down. Then, with a smile on his face, he says to the horse, "You felt it too, didn't you? But we can't go now," concludes the prince as the men disappear from his sight. Cullion then remembers his past, on the day he died. He recalls Kairi's smile as he sacrificed himself to save his life. While the royal family parades on the red carpet, a man comes to greet them. It was Melfer Pullen, the owner of the Emporium, who had prepared a horseback riding show in place of the Romaine family. Cullion then thinks that this does not concern him, because thanks to this he was dragged into a useless war of nerves. He then remembers that it is during this equestrian show that Prince Randall gets injured, and Baron Polan is hanged the same day. Meanwhile, Polan, smiling, presents the path for the royal family. Arriving at the venue, he shows them the seats he had specially prepared for them. The prince, observing the surroundings, noticed the chandelier there. He remembered that this chandelier would fall on Prince Randall. He finds it odd that the guards hadn't checked such a large item, considering the king and the Papal Knights were present. Speaking of the Knight Corps, he recalls that annoying commander. Cullion, then smiling, seems deep in thought. While Polan guides them, he wonders if he should give him a chance to live. The servant tells Cullion to call him if he needs anything. He then says he feels uncomfortable with the chandeliers above. He turns his back and starts walking away, telling Polan to check that. Polan is shocked by the prince's request. He just stands there, looking at the chandelier, not fully understanding the reason. The equestrian show begins. The horses and their skilled riders put on an acrobatic show. Someone with clenched hands is very anxious, thinking that one day this would come for him. It was Polan, who was like this, very happy to be close to His Majesty. He had prepared a lot and couldn't miss this opportunity. Then something behind him catches his attention. It was Prince Cullion, looking a bit bored with the whole performance. Polan remembers his request and goes to check the ropes. With the ropes in hand, Polan is startled by what he sees. The rope was indeed in a very precarious state, almost snapping. He thinks about what would have happened if the prince hadn't warned him. Certainly, what would have happened would have definitely sealed Polan's fate. While he observes the prince, he keeps questioning himself. How could he have known about the rope in the first place? Polan thought. The prince knew that a man like him couldn't miss an opportunity to win over the king. He is perceptive enough to understand the situation and choose what is best for himself, he concluded. But he still wondered what makes the Baron such a terrible enemy in the eyes of the Romain family. Then he noticed the second prince. He was shocked because Planche couldn't take his eyes off him. Meanwhile, Prince Planche was only watching him with the same look as always. Planche then tells him to know his place and calls him an insect. Meanwhile, the event's presenter continues his show with great joy. Up in the royal family's box, the atmosphere is about to become tense as Planche says that the smell of Callion's mother's filthy blood makes him nauseous. Everyone hears Planche's words and is very shocked by it. It even catches the attention of the king, who usually doesn't care about what the princes say. The second prince seems to be very shaken by Planche's words. But in reality, he gives a wicked smile because Planche had spoken at the worst possible time. He didn't expect Planche to be so useful. The king then turned to the front and left it to Celise to handle it to see how she would manage. Behind her fan that covers her face, she is on the edge, thinking that she had warned Planche before. She looks at him out of the corner of her eye with a look of rage, and the prince seems quite calm with it all. This surprises the queen, who thinks he did all that on purpose. Out of all the moments, it had to be today. Rumors quickly spread that the second prince spoke unacceptable words in the presence of the king. People are worried because they can no longer support Planche openly since Cullion has earned the loyalty of the mage. Thus, it is possible that he may be the next chosen heir to the throne. So, people cannot remain idle. The moment to decide who will receive their support is approaching. The show ended without any accidents. Randall avoided the unfortunate accident, and the king did not reprimand Planche for his boldness and disrespect. Cullion then thinks that things are certainly working in his favor. But Celise seems calm, considering that her plan was completely ruined. As he observes the queen, he wonders if she is the mastermind behind it all. In his mind, memories of his past life come to him. A man asking what he thought of the accident he just prevented. Baron then says that it was probably to eliminate one of the three princes. For what other reasons could it be? He asks, and the man does not reply. The man was his brother, who calls him for a bet. And Baron says he has lost many times already and doesn't even know how much he owes him. While they played chess, his brother gives him a hint. He asks if Baron doesn't think the accident seemed staged, almost as if they were announcing that the royal family was the target. The Melfor Merchants Guild is the second largest in Kairos, so for Renan Romain, the head of the kingdom's main merchant guild, it would be very beneficial to remove the Melfor from the game. The prince asks his servant what the most important business of Poland's Merchants Guild is. Ian replies that they are known for their diamond mines. Then Cullion had his answer. With Poland out of the way, the Romain can take over and assume the diamond business. The prince had planned to back off after saving Poland's life, but now he's going to make him pay for the trouble he caused him. Meanwhile, somewhere, Poland trembles in fear. He then asks his servant to clear his schedule for the rest of the day, which surprises the servant because he couldn't miss the ball. He pretends to be shocked by Planche's audacity so that his servant does what he asked, saying that's the reason he won't attend today's commitments. Meanwhile, the vassals are all tidying up the palace to continue the festivities. The king, sitting in his chambers, seems to be very troubled by something. He is very upset and thoughtful about everything that has happened. Then he recalls the mage's words. If he continues as he is, Kalyan will only be the first of many losses he will suffer. Also, Planche's words come to his mind, that he felt disgusted by the smell of Kalyan's mother's filthy blood. Many memories flood the king's mind. Now it was a woman with red hair calling his name. It was Kalyan's mother, once the wife of King Romain. She was on her deathbed. Someone rushes into the king's chamber and startles him. The vassal says that the queen is requesting an audience now. With that, the queen enters the room and heads toward the king. One of the maids, while removing a cup, says she will prepare some tea for the madam. The queen wonders if he has received a guest because she had not been informed of this. The king raises his hand and tells his maid that the tea will not be necessary. He concludes by saying that the queen will not stay long, which leaves the queen a bit annoyed. Romain then asks what brought Celeste there. As she sits down, she says that the Romain house will take full responsibility for the incident. To think that she would lower herself because of Planche's mistake. She must have decided to prioritize her son's reputation. The king brings his hand to his chin, showing he is deep in thought, and asks, "Responsibility? Hasn't she lost none of her insolence?" Responding to the king, saying that the parade was quite impressive today, she asks if Baron Poland does not deserve a reward for organizing such a delightful event. The king replies that she seems to have thought a lot about this. Then she opens her fan, covering her face again, and says that she certainly intends to transfer to him the exclusive supplier rights of the Romain house for the royal stables. She concludes with a smile on her face. The king is astonished and wonders if she would give up such a lucrative investment. Then he remembers the conversation he had with Manisil, who said that the queen knows she would have to give up something to mitigate the damage, but she is still not desperate enough to remove the knights she has positioned in the palace. The mage continues, saying that she will create a proposal she considers to be a fair reward, and as soon as she does, show her that his majesty is willing to turn a blind eye, concluded the mage. Then the king crosses his legs with a much calmer look and says, "Planche and I will enter the ballroom together tonight." This leaves the queen very surprised and happy at the same time. With a smile on her face, she says he will be very delighted with this attitude. According to the agreement, Romain and Planche entered the ballroom side by side, and Baron Poland was named the exclusive supplier of the royal stables. Everyone knew it was the result of Celeste's maneuver to protect her son's reputation. To think that the house would suffer such a blow, the queen is paying the price for Planche's mistake. Which means that Kalyan is now a big enough threat to pressure the queen into taking action. In Kalyan's chamber, he and his servant Ian are stunned. With a pile of gifts in his room, he said that people definitely have no hesitation in switching sides. While his servant asks what to do with the gifts, the prince is just satisfied to see Planche and the Romain losing influence. He then replies that he would like to prevent his hierarchy from being occupied by traitors and tells him to return everything except those from the Arcane Enclave and Poland. As he walks out of his chamber, he tells him not to forget to create a list of the senders. While leaving, he looks at a particular gift that catches his attention. A very large, very bright jeweled necklace, with all red gems. This not only surprises the prince but also all the vassals in that room. Then he asks if that was a horse necklace. He said it's quite specific and asks if Ian mentioned anything, and he replied that he only said the young master liked the raven. That was an unexpected gift. He wondered, jewels for a horse and none for the master? He thinks he is being tested. Accepting that gift would mean allowing him to settle the life debt. Then he would send another treasure, this time to the prince, and consider the favor fully paid. Then the young man, with a smirk, thinks that it's not going to be that easy. He would not be satisfied with a mere jewel. He told his servant to find out how much the necklace costs and send the money to Poland, and then asks if they are buying it, and the prince said they are not buying it because it's unique. While pointing to a carnivorous plant, he said that the prize for originality goes to that one. Ian took it to see who the gift was from, and it was from the Arcane Enclave. The prince, surprised, says, "Sorcerers and their sense of aesthetics." While picking up a paper to read, his servant said it is quite rare and that there are some instructions here. It's a magical flower that releases bioluminescent pollen upon death, popular among herbologists. At first, the prince didn't seem to understand the reason for the gift, but then something clicked in his mind, and he smiled as if he had understood now. His servant then asks if he should send it back to the Enclave, and the prince said no, that they will keep it. While the maid arranges his room, the young man seems to have had an idea. Then a scream from Ian catches the maid's attention. In the background, Ian asks if everything is okay, and he replies that yes, it just slipped out of his hand. The teacup had fallen and spilled everything on the floor. Ian tells one of the maids to clean up the mess, and while cleaning the prince's clothes, he noticed that the tea had spilled on the flour. The flour had become partially covered with the tea liquid. While a maid was cleaning the mess, Ian asks if that won't harm the plant. The prince says aloud that no, it's not as if the tea were poisoned. This statement surprises the maid, and he tells them to leave the flower pot where it is because he liked it. Two men ride on their horses as one thanks the other for taking time out of his busy schedule. It was the prince and the mage, who said he couldn't refuse while the young man was risking his life. The mage said that he seems much happier outside than inside. The prince agrees. He was going to say that it was his first time, but he changes the sentence and says he was just looking for some fun. He needs to remember that he is Kalyan and no longer Baron. He asks the mage if he really got his majesty's prescription for this excursion. The mage said that the request must be reaching him now. Baron is not surprised by what the mage did and considers himself just as guilty as he is. He recalled sneaking away from Ian to go with the mage, who says that he was his apprentice. The prince is pleased and said he would take that as a compliment. Manhwa asks if he's taking the antidote regularly. Baron then looks at the mage with a very serious expression and says that yes, besides that, he took a dose earlier today and is feeling much better now. So much so that the poisoner is starting to panic. All the pieces will fall into place once they step into the trap, concluded the prince. The mage said he admires his creativity, that maybe he never really needed him, and the prince says that's not true. With a smile on his face, he said that none of this would have been possible without that interesting gift the mage sent him. Then, as they reached a certain point in the kingdom, they stopped their horses. The mage then turns his horse to face the opposite direction. He said he will go there and leave him here. He thinks he should go along with his apprentice but will let him do as he wishes. The prince, then pulling his hood over his head, says that he knew the mage would understand him. Manhwa said that there's a magic shop on Tainansha Street, and wants him to meet him there when he finishes his task. Starting to spur his horse, the prince says he will meet him there, and wishes good luck to both of them. They then head in opposite directions. Then we see a very strong man forging a sword. The prince holds this sword in his hands in front of his face, which reflects his red eye. Leaving there on his horse, he thinks that this should be enough. He places his sword in the sheath and concludes, saying that he'll manage with this sword until his custom order is ready. Standing in a dark alley a bit ahead of the blacksmith shop, he thinks that to proceed from here on out, he only needs information. Secretia maintains a network across the entire continent to obtain information from other nations. However, these spies do more than just gather information. Each agent undergoes years of rigorous training to become an elite assassin, and the people who built this network of assassins are none other than King Debuin, who was Burn's father, the prince's past self. He covers his face well with a hood, and moves forward in the dark alley where he sees two men who appear to be drunk. He is already near the Pigeon Mail Center on Narasha Street. Baron knew how dangerous the assassins could be, as the one who trained them was him. As the drunken men pass by the prince, he just adjusts his hood so that he won't be recognized. Now, being one of the princes of cares, if the assassins notice his presence there, they will probably try to kidnap him or do something even worse. Black hair and red eyes are simply too eye-catching. He knew that the best thing to do was just to keep his head down. Then he enters the Pigeon Mail Center, a rather large place with apparently 2 floors and many birds. As he walks through the place, he thinks it's much bigger than it looks. Then a young man who appears to be an employee asks if he's looking for a carrier pigeon, and the prince replies that he is not. He says that the birds haven't woken up yet, which catches the attendant's attention. The man says they are the drowsy type. The protagonist says they must have traveled a long distance because they look tired, and the man says that's why they're sleeping. While observing a bird that seems to have the shape of a key on its back, Baron says that's where the birds rest. Then the man asks him what he is doing there. He promptly responds that he wants bird food. The man said he came to the right place, but in the blink of an eye, the prince is attacked by the attendant, who just cut off a piece of the young man's hood. With his dagger against the back of his neck, he says he doesn't remember selling any pigeons recently. Baron then thinks that this man is no ordinary fighter, and that Kalyan's body was not ready to face him. Placing his hand on the man's dagger and lowering it, the prince says that it's obvious that he hadn't sold any birds because he just arrived in this kingdom. The man just observes with a calm and serene look. Here, birds means spies, and bird food means information. Secretion spies keep their identities hidden even from their allies to avoid compromising the mission if one is captured. The man then asks him whose spy he is. The prince gives a half smile and remains calm. He knew they had no way of knowing, even though he used his father Nebulade's name to disguise himself as a Secretion spy. He then responds that he is one of Nebulade's. The man is very shocked by his words. This makes Kalyan the first Cyresian prince in history to spy on his own kingdom. Calmly, he says that if that's settled, he would like to receive some information as he has just left the nest. Then the man opens a secret passage. He tells the young man to follow him as he walks ahead. While he attentively watches the tunnel, the man says they will run into each other quite a bit there, and that he can call him White Hawk. And the young man responds that he can call him Red Swan. The man then says he will certainly remember that name. They arrive at a place full of books, and the man asks what kind of bird food he's looking for. Burin says it's an item and a piece of information. The man then says it will cost 8 fire ends. He emphasizes that payment is upfront, which surprises the prince, thinking that the man doesn't even know what kind of information he's looking for. He wonders if he's trying to confuse him. The man replies without even being asked that they charge a flat fee in case he's wondering. He then hands the young man an item and a piece of information. Taking the paper, he opens it and starts reading and asks if he's sure that this is the correct location. The White Hawk then says it's the only place that meets his request, and then the prince thanks him for his help. As he was about to leave, the man tells him to be careful. This catches his attention because that man didn't seem like someone who cared about another's well-being. The hawk then says that it's not exactly the safest place. Then the prince, opening the door, agrees with him. Of all the dangerous things in this place, I'm sure nothing is more dangerous than you, White Hawk, thought Burin. The prince then continues his path to find the destination he wanted to reach. Near the bridge where he had to cross, there was a group of people in front of it, and he wonders what they are doing there as he tries to pass unnoticed. But then his horse gets startled by something. The prince then tries to calm the horse because there was no reason for it to be frightened. Then a man from the group of people approaches the young man. He says that the dead are embarking on their final journey, and if he is not in a hurry, asks him to wait for a moment. The prince doesn't understand what he means by the dead, but looking at the river, he realizes it's a farewell ceremony. Dismounting from his horse, he says that he can wait and that he would not want to disturb the dead on their final journey. Each nation has its own way of bidding farewell to the deceased. Cyresians believe that souls leave the world in red flowers along the river. Crossing bridges while they pass is said to lead the souls astray from their correct path. In his homeland, Secretia, we place sinistar flowers on the graves to mourn the dead. The white petals of the sinistars wither when the sun rises and bloom purple under the night sky. They serve as a reminder that the living and the dead, like day and night, will forever be separated. This rite provides closure for the Secretian people when they say goodbye to their loved ones. Baron patiently waited for the people's rite to end, and in his thoughts, he wondered if his brother also placed a sinistar flower on his grave, or he might have used the Arcus Tempus before that, the prince thought. Then the idea came to his mind that he might be a lost soul who was led down the wrong path. The man who had asked him to wait for the rite thanks him for waiting until they finished, and says that now he can continue on his way. Then the young man just observes without saying a word. He mounts his horse, thinking that no matter what happened before, he is now the Prince of Kairos. Then he removes his hood and tells the man that now the souls can travel peacefully, and that may they rest in peace. The man is astonished to see his face. The prince then continues his way, crossing the bridge. Meanwhile, the man watches him leave, and another person calls his attention to conclude the rite. She asks if something happened to him, and he says no. That was Arsene, High Magistrate of the Valcanum, the man who caused Burin's death when he was the Prince of Secretia. He then removes his hood and tells his companion that the man he was talking to seemed like a good man. Every shop I've passed until now has had the name Suspanian, Burin thought. Standing in front of the tavern named Suspanian, he said, "This is really incredible." And in the end, the spies who always said that Ceres is full of Suspanian followers were not wrong. He enters the tavern, and a man welcomes him, saying he will find a table for him. Then the young prince says it is not necessary. He says he has business on the 4th floor, pointing upwards. Then the man is very surprised by his response. With a slightly choked voice, he agrees and opens the door for him to enter. Then the man shows the prince the way, and he follows right behind him. The man then opens the door and wishes him a pleasant time. Cullion then enters a completely empty room with only tables and chairs. Then he notices a coat rack fixed to the wall that has an additional detail. He then recalls the information he bought from the White Hawk. It was the location of the Criminal Activity Center in the royal capital of Ceres. The prince grabs the coat rack and, turning it to the left, activates the mechanism. This mechanism opens a secret door right next to the coat rack. Asking to be taken to the 4th floor of this 2-story building is the password to get there, which means that the upper floors are just a front for a hidden underground basement. Going down the stairs, he continues thinking that the establishment he's looking for is not the gambling house on the 3rd floor where small amounts are bet, but rather what is hidden even further below. Then the prince reaches a door and slowly opens it. There, men are fighting fiercely against each other. It seemed to be a fighting ring, and there were many people around watching the fight. This was where the prince wanted to go. The crowd around fiercely demands that they treat each other more kindly, as they had placed bets on the more affectionate one. Then the announcer shouts that they have a victor. Another win for Gerard the Gentle. Payment slips will be distributed shortly, and those who bet on the white, don't forget to claim your prizes, announces the presenter. As the man who lost is dragged out of the ring, the crowd curses him fiercely. The prince, standing in a corner, thinks, "The strong smell makes the air suffocating, and the screams of those who have abandoned their humanity. What a repulsive sight." concluded the prince as he watched that chaos. A man then comes close to Baron, catches his attention, and tells him that he forgot to pay. Baron pays the man, who then calls one of the attendants to take him to table 27. A very beautiful woman with blue hair and a red dress approaches him. She takes him by the arm and gestures for him to follow her, making him wonder if she has a problem speaking. The woman then turns around, and Kalyan notices her ear. The prince is shocked because her ear had been mutilated. It doesn't seem like they're wearing these clothes by choice, and the tracking collars around their necks, the prince observed. And as he was deep in thought, realizing they were kept under constant surveillance, she poked him. She pointed at him, and then at the tray right after, as if asking if he wanted to place a bet. Baron puts his hand in his pocket, thinking that he should probably make a bet. I'll dance to their tune as well until I get what I came here for, he thought as he placed his money on the black side of the tray. The rules are simple in places like this. Bet your money on the fighters, and the winning side receives double. If you bet 3, you leave with 6. If you bet 6, you receive 12, and with enough winnings. Then the announcer declares the winner of the 10th match of the night, Pantheron of the Steel Legs. Once again, the announcer announces that payment slips will be distributed soon. Those who bet on the black side, please don't forget to collect your prizes. Everyone is astonished because Baron's 3 fire-ins had turned into 1,536. People observe that pile of money on the table and whisper among themselves. Baron then thinks that they are not here for the money. The final match of the night. Win 4 times as much. That's right, the special match everyone's been waiting for, the announcer declared. On the white side, shone the raging hammer, and on the black side, the relentless challenger, the unshakable. The prince, upon seeing who it was very shocked. In a memory, Kalyan sees the man saying that he was a fighter in the arenas, forced to spill others' blood for money, until his little sister died, and that changed his fate. Then the announcer shouts, "Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you," while the man seems to be warming up for the fight. "Do you wish to be a knight, Kyrie?" someone asks, and he replies, "Not a knight, my prince, but a sword. My desire is to be your blade," he responded, placing his hand on his chest. Baron remembered his last moment in life when he told him to take up his sword and not give up. Then Kyrie is announced in the ring, and the announcer calls him the Demon Eye. Immediately, the young prince grabs his coins and places them on the tray, and shouts, saying that he's going to bet everything on the black side. The attendant is shocked by his decision. Then the entire place is stunned that he has wagered everything he has on that man. While people ask if he's an idiot or just completely insane, he simply smiles as if to say he knows what he's doing. Then the announcer shouts, "With 0 victories, Kyrie has yet to triumph in the arena. Will he rewrite his record today?" Someone asks the young prince if he is sure he wants to throw his money away like that. It was a large blonde man sitting a bit ahead who turned to Baron. The man tells him to place his chips on another fighter, because the one he bet on has never won a single fight. Then Baron asks the attendant beside him if she's already counted his chips, and he confirms again that his bet is on the black side and asks her to verify it. The man is then a bit upset, and says he was just trying to warn him because it's not his money on the line. "The raging hammer rarely lets his opponents leave intact," says the announcer. As the entire crowd shouts fiercely, Kyrie observes the newcomer who bet everything he had on him. Warming up for the fight, his opponent says that another newbie gambler is going to starve because of a stray mutt who refuses to quit the ring. The 2 fighters stare each other down, and the start of the fight is announced. Before their chains even hit the ground, Kyrie's opponent leaps at him very quickly. He starts attacking right away, and Kyrie defends to avoid being hit in the head. While he defends, another attack comes from the left, but he also manages to block that attack, protecting himself. The man, who is very fast, says that Kyrie is too slow, and lands a kick on his stomach, sending him flying backward, making him spit out strawberry juice, while the crowd screams for Hammer to finish him off. Baron can't believe what he's seeing and slams the table. With an angry look, he thinks that Kyrie is a punching bag when he's without a sword. This should be easy for him. Why is he getting beaten? Baron asked. Kyrie tries to land another punch, but he is too slow for his opponent, who mocks him. The man returns the powerful punch, telling him to give up. Hammer continues to throw blows at him, relentlessly, and says that today is his end. While he's preparing to deliver what seems to be the final punch, Baron stands up from his chair and shouts, calling Kyrie's name, drawing his attention. Then Baron yells at him to lower his shoulder right before the punch hits. He hears what he's told but doesn't understand why. Then, as the punch is about to land, Kyrie lowers his shoulder and dodges Hammer's powerful punch. He continues lowering himself as if to gain momentum. He then prepares his fist to strike his opponent. Baron is happy that he managed to dodge and watches closely. Then Kyrie punches Hammer in the stomach with all his strength. He keeps hitting his opponent non-stop, without tiring. With great force, he delivers a punch to Hammer's face, breaking his teeth. Hammer then falls to the mat after Kairi's powerful blow. Everyone watching that fight is stunned, because no one expected him to be able to win that match. People then ask if everyone saw that because it seemed like a mirage, as Kairi defeated the feared raging Hammer. Then the announcer declares his victory. All the bettors are furious at Hammer because the vast majority had bet on him. Looking at the crowd, he sees the man who gave him tips to win. The young prince is very happy with his victory, but before he can even celebrate this win, a man comes up behind him and asks him to follow him. Baron then turns to the man, who is a tall, strong, dark-skinned individual, who says that someone wants to speak with him. He followed the man, who led him to a room. Sitting on the sofa, the guy who brought him there stands guard by the door and praises him for making so much money with just 3 coins. While the one by the door slowly draws his sword from its sheath, the other keeps saying it's a lot of money. With a wicked smile that reveals his gold tooth, he says a kid like him shouldn't be handling so much money. Baron then just gives a slight smile. He said the man doesn't even have the decency to try negotiating, and that he's dumber than expected. With an angry look, he tells him to take off his hood because he wants to take a good look before breaking his nose. While holding his hood, he asks if the man is sure about that. "This hood might be the only thing keeping you out of trouble," said the prince. The man says he's dying of curiosity as he gestures for his goons to go and take it off. Then his henchmen, who looked like 2 brutes, approach the young prince. One of them reaches out his hand toward the young man's hood and tells him not to be shy because they want to see the face he's hiding. Then, quickly, the hand reaching for the hood was slashed by a blade. With a dagger in his hand after striking the man, Baron asks if people in their line of work shouldn't be quick. "Where's your instinct?" he asks the man. The man is frightened because Baron was very skilled with the dagger and says he needs more time to prepare the money. While skillfully handling the dagger, Baron says the man can keep his gold. In exchange, he'll take Kairi and points the dagger at the man. He says his master won't be happy because the guy had just started making a living. "You're mistaken if you think I'm going to accept such a ridiculous offer," thought the man. "Maybe you can defend yourself in a fight, but we have the numbers advantage here," he concluded while watching the young man. Meanwhile, Baron just kept holding his dagger pointed at the man. The man says they won't hand over Kairi. Then he's startled by something coming toward him. His table was cut, and part of his pants too, and the young man says, "You can keep the gold and your life." With his dagger in hand, exuding mana, Baron asks if he now has his attention. The man, terrified and desperate, asks if that was a sword's aura. He points to a henchman, shouting at him to leave and bring Kairi. Kalyan hopes he won't have to do this again. As expected, Kalyan's body can't withstand the power of this aura. Then the henchman who went to get Kairi returns and says there is a problem. The boss, still without pants, asks what the problem is, and the henchman says that Kairi refuses to leave Hina behind. This name seems to trigger something in Kalyan's mind. He then remembers a conversation he had with Kairi while still in his body. Marco said his sister chose death when he left the quarters. He admits he failed her in the end. Kalyan pats the boss's shoulder and says he knows what to do. The boss then desperately shouts to bring the girl as well, but Kalyan says he'd like to go personally. While the boss promises to ensure no one bothers him on the way, Kalyan extends his hand towards him. The boss didn't understand what he meant by that gesture. He then told the man to refund him the 3 fire ends and the entry fee, with a mocking look. Outside the establishment, Kalyan stands beside his horse, while Kairi and Hina are a little behind. Hina shows a lot of fear, unsure of what is happening. Then Kairi hugs Hina to protect her. He thanks Kalyan for getting him out of there. Kalyan says nothing, just glancing sideways. Kairi mentions he doesn't know why Kalyan is helping them while something quickly approaches. In the blink of an eye, Kalyan takes off his coat and covers Hina, saying they can lower their guard with it. He assures them he means no harm. Kairi is terrified upon seeing the young man without the hood covering his face, for he recognized that it was Prince Kalyan. He bows his head slightly, apologizing, saying they should have recognized him sooner. Kalyan places his hand on his shoulder and tells him to raise his head. He says they don't need to bow before him. Half-elf siblings without a coin in their pocket. Kalyan could imagine the kind of past they had. In the previous timeline, Kairi failed to protect his sister. "You tend to expose your shoulders in a fight, a common habit for those who've just started training with a sword. Do you want to become a knight? Is that why you're honing your sword skills?" asked the prince. Kairi replied that he doesn't want to be a knight, but a blade that protects everyone. This answer surprises the young man. He then handed a sword to Kairi, saying that to be like the blade, he must serve as his shield. That was the condition for teaching him the art of the sword and that he should seek him out when he made his decision. Kairi asked why he was being so kind to them. With a slight smile on his face, he says he needs a sharp blade. But in his thoughts, it was the least he could do to thank his old comrade. Meanwhile, on Tynaxian Street, everything is deserted as it is late at night. There was the office of the Mage Association. The mage who had been sent to the cavalry performance reported the following. The prince is concerned about Polun and told us to keep an eye on him, read Manisil. Polun had found a cut rope at the last banquet. He finished reading as he set the letter on fire. As the letter burned, he observed and wondered how his apprentice knew all this. Then the prince arrives, sweaty and with wrinkled clothes. With a smile on his face and a tone of relief, he says he has arrived. The mage looks him up and down, assessing his state. Got into a fight or something, your highness? The mage asked. The prince sits down and replies that there were some unforeseen events. While the mage goes to get some tea, he says the young man seemed to have had a busy day. It was a long day. I got some information and also set a trap in Dorsey's company, he responded. As he stretched, the prince wondered why the mage seemed so worried. If it were just him, he was impressed by how much he had done in such a short time. The mage just watched him as he made tea. When the prince saw how the mage made the tea, he was astonished because everything was done through magic. Finally, he was in a mage's office. The mage noticed his excitement and asked if he was expecting some kind of magic potion with an eye inside, to which the prince replied, "Almost that." As he finished answering the mage's question, he looked at the desk and saw a blunt dagger, saying it didn't match the decor. Then he looked more closely at the dagger, and something caught his attention. It was the dagger he had acquired earlier. The mage then asks what the prince's sword is doing there. With a somewhat surprised tone, he said it wasn't supposed to be there. Suddenly, the dagger starts flying, which frightens him. Then the dagger flies toward the prince's chest. With the dagger almost hitting him, he knew it was too late to dodge. The mage merely watches everything with his arms crossed. He then says that even with this weak body, he was really fast. The prince manages to evade using aura on his own dagger. Before the dagger hits the ground, it flies back again as the mage mentions that it is a magical artifact created by Suspanian. It reveals a copy of the hidden weapons of the opponent, concludes the mage, holding the dagger. A kind of warning, don't you think? Asks the mage, while the prince is panting, as it is always painful to use his mana. It was only supposed to be a test, and he overreacted and did more than necessary. The mage asks how it was more than necessary if he doesn't even know how to properly hold a sword. The prince just remains seated on the sofa with his hand on his chest, panting. Then the mage touches his shoulder and says that on the day they first met, the meeting with the prince didn't go as desired, but he knew that little by little, things started to get strange. He showed conversations he had with the king, saying that the nobles were amazed by the fact that he had changed, and from the queen, saying that when he discovered he was poisoned, he showed more will to live than fear of death. That feeling could only belong to someone who had already shed a lot of blood. Besides, he already knew there would be an incident during the cavalry performance. The mage asks if the prince can explain everything to him. The prince then feels his body regenerating faster thanks to the healing magic. While he heals, he wonders if the mage is suspecting him, but he believed the mage was just trying to trust him. Then, slamming his hand on the table, he says he is not Kalyan, and that his real name is Baron Secretia. The two sit facing each other. The mage asks him, before everything else, to tell if the real Prince Kalyan is dead. Shaking his head in a gesture of denial, he says it's not quite like that. In the beginning, he had doubts, but then he was sure that Kalyan is still alive and that he can feel his presence. The mage then remembers that on the day they met, Kalyan said that the throne wasn't what he wanted. So he asks what it is that he wants. Baron calmly responds that he wants to prevent wars. He still doesn't know why Kyrie wants the axis of time. If there is any lingering cause, everything will repeat itself, and he wants to discover the reason behind it. The mage then calmly asks if what he wants is of interest to Chase, the legitimate heir, or to Baron. Baron doesn't understand the question and asks what he meant by that. The mage replies that before anything, Baron needs to know something. Currently, Secretia only has Prince Chase. The issue is that he was the son of a concubine. However, the queen couldn't have children, and Baron cannot exist here. The mage finishes explaining, leaving Kalyan very surprised. Baron felt an extreme emptiness and very lost. Deep in thought, he wondered if he might not exist, neither in Secretia nor anywhere else. Kalyan is lost in his thoughts and his fears. He wonders why and how that happened. Kalyan's body lived in perfect condition. He said that deep down, he felt something. The prince says that sometimes he wondered if someone entered his body just like he entered Kalyan's. As long as I'm alive, there can't be another Baron. The young man seemed sad with this whole story. He knew that, even so, it was no different from stealing someone's life. Then the mage tries to explain the situation in Secretia, saying that Chase is the only heir to the throne. You should know that the past and present are not the same, and the future might have been altered. The three princes of Kairos are at risk of their lives, unlike you, the prince of Secretia who grew up with the best friend, says the mage. The mage keeps a serious face while Kalyan looks surprised, and he says that this means they shouldn't be stuck in the past. He decides to clarify things with the mage, saying that what he fears won't happen. When he came to Kairos on the first day, as soon as he opened his eyes, at that exact moment, He had given up living as Burin. These words left the mage very surprised, as he wasn't expecting this. Kullian asks if the mage is really fine with all of this, even though he is not the crown prince of Kairos. The mage, with a smile on his face, says that there is nothing to worry about and that he can assure him that from the beginning, only one person had a connection with him, and with the priest. Already mounted on their horses, Burin wonders if the mage knew about the Arcus Tempus from the start, so he decided to ask if he knew a lot about the temporal axis. The mage just maintains a serious expression while riding beside Kullian. He began saying that last year, during this same month, Prince Chase came to him asking for advice about the temporal axis. He infiltrated Secretia and couldn't find any other information except that the axis wasn't made by a man. And last month, he received a letter from Secretia about the disappearance of the axis exactly when you said you returned 10 years in time. Burin is astonished that he went back in time during the same period when the temporal axis disappeared. Burin said that maybe that's why it vanished. Before he could finish his sentence, the mage interrupts, saying that even if this is a huge problem, they still don't have the answer. He said that, however, there is someone they can ask. Someone who knew more than the mage, and who would soon meet the prince. This someone was Cispanian, who was mentioned before. The prince just agrees with what the mage decided. His passage ritual is approaching, a ritual that takes place when a new member joins the royalty of Cispanian, and it is there that everyone understands the will of Cispanian. The mage says that the priority is to stay alive to complete the passage ritual, so please try to do what must be done. Burin probably said that even if he couldn't. The seeds that were planted have already started to sprout. Back at the palace, in his quarters, his servant said he was very worried about the prince's departure. The prince examines the plant he received from the mage, and seems to have noticed something, while his servant tells him to wash his face before going to bed. The prince, with a smile on his face, asks if he wants to see something cool. Then they go to the palace terrace. It was early morning, and it was cold. The plant we received as a gift from the Mage Society. Being extremely rare, its characteristics are not known by all. That day, I pretended it was an accident and ended up spilling poison into the flower pot without anyone noticing, and I observed the servants' reactions during that time. A normal person wouldn't survive even 7 days with that poison, let alone a plant. However, this plant remains alive as if someone deliberately swapped it, thought the prince. On the terrace, Ian sees something very shiny and calls his attention. He is amazed by the size of the glow. A shiny trail formed through the palace courtyard. If they swapped it, it won't be easy to get rid of the pot. I would have to keep it in a safe place. And that way, he will know the truth, concluded the prince. Of course, the owner of the Hija Palace, thought the prince. May Celise await him. The next day dawned rainy, and the prince watched the rain fall from the sky through his window. Then someone enters his room, and he turns to see who it is. It was Ian, who brought tea and was greeted with a "Good morning." The prince asks if he slept well last night. Kullian seems to be in a very good mood with a bright face and cheerful expression. Ian, somewhat surprised, said that he slept well and asks if His Highness slept well. Placing the tray with the tea on the table, he said that it's a bit strange to hear the prince ask if he slept well first, and the young man said that today he woke up early. Ian said that's good because today the sun will rise in the west. The prince picks up his cup of tea to drink. While he sips, Ian asks if it was the sound of the rain that woke him up. It's subtle, but I can still feel it. You increase the amount of poison, Celise, thought the prince. He asked Ian if there is any event next week where all the nobles will be present. His servant said that there would be a meeting, and all the nobles will be here, including His Majesty the King. So the prince knew that in a week, after the nobles' meeting, there would be a banquet, and that day would be the perfect opportunity for him to test the poison. So Celise, enjoy it while you can, thought the prince. Then he takes in his hand the pill that the mage gave him, and he takes it quickly as if it were candy. He hands the cup to Ian, who asks him a question. He wanted to know if the prince has been eating properly these past days, and he is told that he's only been having nutrients. Closing the pouch where he kept his pills, he said he feels weak today and asks to go down to have breakfast. Ian agrees and goes to help His Highness get dressed. His servant was surprised because the prince had drunk all the tea he had, and wonders why the prince is so worried like this. Already at the breakfast table, after that incident at the theater, Blanche hadn't been showing up for breakfast. The young man thought it was much better that way so that he wouldn't ruin his plans. While the first prince drank his wine, Kullian mentioned that soon the roses would bloom. Then Randall was surprised by the statement, and quickly looked at Kullian, who just smiled. They stared at each other for a brief period. Randall stands up from the table, and leaves without finishing his meal. Ian whispers, asking if the prince didn't think it was a bit random to talk about roses at breakfast, and the protagonist says it was because he saw flowers in the hallway, and he remembered the way Randall cared for the roses. His servant said that didn't make much sense, and the young man just continued eating his breakfast. The prince then trains in the rain in the castle garden. He is very soaked, a mixture of sweat and rain. While leaning against a tree, panting and tired, someone arrives, saying that he is getting worse by the day and asks what he is doing. The prince responds that if he keeps avoiding physical training, it will be difficult to get better. The one there was his master, who appeared suddenly. The mage said he was talking to Lemian. The prince is astonished that he called someone by their first name, and the mage says that there's nothing special about it, it's just a common name. He asks why the prince called him there, and Kalyan responds that he wants to ask for 2 things. The first is that he will need 2 identities, and the mage says he can arrange that easily. And the prince says the second thing is that he wants to investigate the cases of death involving the nobles, especially the relationship with Romain. They both say together. With a smile on his face, the mage says that's not a big deal either, and that he's going easy on his master, but he asks if he's in a hurry. Answering, the prince says that the amount of poison has increased, and he believes he has already figured out the culprit. The mage says he already has an idea of who it might be, and the prince mentions that soon they'll start to put pressure on the mage. I know it's difficult to get a hold of a great mage, but the master needs a trump card, he concluded. Manasal asks if, by any chance, he's planning to use him as a distraction. Baron, with a firm gaze, says not as a distraction but as a weapon. That's right, a weapon. I know the power of mages better than anyone. Those who killed me in my own country, the mage army, the white demons. He then ends by saying that he will form a society of mages loyal to him. Manasal was very astonished by the young prince's words. He said that mages aren't like knights, they are born that way. They don't go through training. Baron then says there's something he hasn't told him yet, and that it worked in the previous timeline, which caught the mage's attention. When King Romain first expressed the desire to establish his own mage society in Kyrus, everyone, including Romain's nobility, laughed. The idea was quickly dismissed, but thanks to that, the king managed to start the plan, without drawing public attention despite its success. Shortly after the consolidation of the mage society, Romain died under suspicious circumstances. With the king deceased, the society swore loyalty to his heir, Planche, and became at peace in his conquest, as you are already aware. But now I won't allow this to happen so easily this time, said the prince. The young man knew he must act cautiously because the House of Romain will try to thwart his plans. Baron says the trump card he has is the poison tea that Celise has been giving him. The mage didn't understand what the young prince meant by this, and he asks if Kalyan could share the details. With a smile on his face, the young man replies that he'll find out soon. The mage is disappointed with the response, and the prince tells him to speak with the king because he suspects that there is much on his mind. The prince then says that the mage can rest assured. Celise is destined to make mistakes and will be forced to negotiate. We must seize this opportunity to gain an advantage. We are applying more poison as ordered by your majesty, said the maid, slamming her hand on the table. The queen said she wouldn't tolerate mistakes. The rumors are spreading among the people. This type of talk is not to my liking. Or should I keep facing this inconvenience? Asked the queen, filled with fear. Her maid said no. And while they were talking at the table, a man approached. The queen said she had no choice when her disobedient son refused to fulfill his responsibilities. It was Planche who was approaching the queen, and he seemed angry. He said that the queen was meddling and that he came there just to tell her that. The queen replied that his opinion didn't matter in this matter because he hadn't taken a single action to make his future more promising. Dramatically, the queen said that unfortunately, these are the pains of motherhood. If she had to give her all for the sake of her son, then so be it. Then Planche clenched his fists in rage. He quickly turned his back to his mother and left her presence. While sipping her tea, the queen said that he was very weak, and that his path to the throne would be free of competitors. Then the day of the move arrived. The day was beautiful, and someone was humming. Someone is in a good mood. You've been singing all day. Are you that excited? Asked Kyrie. We are finally going to the royal palace, and that means we will be able to see the prince again, replied Hina. Kyrie asked if she liked him, and she said he was amazing, that she couldn't wait for tonight. Meanwhile, at the palace, the tailor and his assistants were adjusting the prince's outfit. Ian was making the final touches on the details of the clothes, and informed him that he had to be at the banquet in an hour. The prince said he needed Ian to do something for him. The young man thought that it was time to end this game. The weakest and youngest was forced to drink and ended up poisoned. But now he would refuse in an elegant and polite manner. Entering the banquet hall, the vassal announced his arrival. He and the queen briefly exchanged glances. Now was the moment to start a new wave of changes. Meanwhile, Ian was riding his horse quickly, and in his mind was the prince's request. He had asked him to deliver 2 letters, one to the Arcane Enclave and another to Master Alan, and he was to deliver the one to the Enclave first before visiting his master. The prince said he would take care of himself, and everything would be fine. Ian was a little anxious about it, because it wasn't the first time the prince had acted like this. As he finished his thought, realizing he was worrying for no reason, we returned to the banquet, where a glass of wine falls to the floor. This startled everyone present, especially the king. Someone was collapsing to the ground in front of the queen. While all this was happening at the palace, we shift to the enclave. A woman with purple hair says to Manisil that all the records he requested are there. The official documents themselves are enough to sift through, said the woman. It was Yuria Siren, head of the Cyresian Arcane Enclave. But to think something so big was kept a secret from the public. I don't think the nobles had much choice, said the mage. Lesser houses wouldn't dare make enemies of the Romaine house, concluded Yuria. It was to save their own necks from unfortunate accidents. She asks if he has any idea what Prince Kalyan wants with this information. The mage then pondered on how to respond to her. But the door was suddenly opened, and someone called for Madame Yuria. It was Ian, who arrived sweating because he had come very quickly, but he was relieved because both recipients were there. He then handed Prince Kalyan's letter to the mage. While the mage read the letter he received, Ian handed the letter to Yuria. The mage quickly stood up, grabbed his coat, and asked where the banquet was being held that evening. Ian asked where he was going so suddenly, and said he would need an invitation. Yuria shouted, saying they didn't have time for that because Kalyan's life was at stake. Ian was very frightened by what the mage had just said. The letter stated that tonight Kalyan would risk his own life to force Celeste to negotiate, and that if things went wrong, he was counting on the mage to save him. An hour before all of this had happened, Kalyan was having tea with the queen, face to face. He suggested that they drop their masks. Closing her fan quickly, the queen agreed. Tapping the fan on the table, she said that it would hardly make a difference. While calmly drinking his tea, Kalyan said he asked to drop the masks. And not your manners, he said, staring at the queen. A duel of words? Is that the best you can do? I was expecting to be surprised, said the queen. The queen stands up and says that she expected more and regrets having wasted her time, adding that a commoner like him would never understand the courtesy of keeping guests entertained. Kalyan simply states that he is aware of the poison. Placing the cup on the table, he said that he thinks he's had enough and can't imagine developing a taste for it. The queen then feigns confusion and asks what he meant. With a smile on her face, she said his joke didn't have the desired effect. Kalyan asks her not to worry, as he came prepared and that there are other ways to sharpen his weakened mind. Saying that he wondered what he should risk to ensure she would behave, he picks up a vial. The only valuable thing I have is this strong heart, so I've decided to risk it, said the prince. Showing the vial he picked up, he explained that the substance inside it could stop the heart for a brief moment. The queen then leans on the table while he speaks. The prince said that neither silver spoons nor magical catalysts could detect the substance, and that it doesn't work on him because his heart is protected by the blessing of Suspanian. But since the blessing can only mitigate one damage at a time, drinking the poison here would allow her poison to spread through his body and kill him. And if I were to die poisoned alone in your company, who do you think would be held responsible? Asked the prince. The queen then made a disdainful expression. She laughed heartily in Kalyan's face, and asked if he thought he could threaten her with this, adding that he shouldn't imagine he's the first enemy she's faced in this way. She continued saying that the world knew she had killed Kalyan's mother, but they chose silence. So what made him think it would be different this time? Hearing these words made the prince furious. He then asked her what he should do with that then. The queen, with a smile on her face, told him to feel free to do what he must. The prince then agreed and drank the tea. He drank it all in one go, and the queen just watched. With a wicked smile on her face, she called him a fool and asked who would have the courage to blame her. Not even Romain himself would be able to subject me to his will, said the queen, smiling. There was nothing in Kairos that I couldn't have, including the queen's throne. And over time, I removed what was in my way and soon got everything I wanted, but there was still one thing left. There was still something that was mine, the queen thought as she looked at the king. Then, just as the banquet was announced to begin, someone started coughing. The queen just watched as if she were amused, thinking that he was the last one left. Prince Kalyan then collapsed to the ground, coughing up strawberry juice. Everyone present at the banquet was shocked by the scene and stood up to help. People screamed for someone to call the priest. The queen, behind her fan, seemed to be having a lot of fun. Kalyan lay at her feet. Everyone was in a panic, and many questions were in the air. Whether the drink was poisoned, whether he had been poisoned before the banquet, and who he was with before the banquet. Then a man demanded silence if they didn't want to die. The queen felt victorious, as no one dared to accuse her. The king ran towards Kalyan. Holding the prince in his arms, he pleaded for him to stay with him. Kalyan then called him father, which surprised the king. The king then remembered the day when Kalyan's mother passed away. She had asked him to protect their son. Then Kalyan tried to say something but couldn't, and just pointed. The king seemed to understand what he was trying to say. The queen expressed shock that something so disgraceful had happened in the palace, and said she could no longer stay there, and would return to the Haija palace. The king, with the prince in his arms, spoke with great anger, asking how she had dared to do this to their son. Then he shouted the name of Queen Celise very loudly. Everyone was shocked, as they never expected to see this happen. The queen then turned to the king with a look that was no longer one of happiness but of astonishment. Then whispers started spreading, saying the two had been together earlier, some wondering if it was she who poisoned him and others saying they wouldn't be surprised if she had done it. The queen gripped her fan tightly. She covers her face with the fan and says that he doesn't know what he's talking about and asks if he didn't already have a chronic condition. The king, filled with rage, says that she was there when Freya died and, along with all the knights, said the same thing. He then recalls her saying that Freya had passed away due to an illness. "Celise, even if it's true, you will be held responsible," said the king. The queen then asks who can guarantee that he was always healthy, adding that no one here will believe him. With a slight smile on her face, she continues, "Perhaps the princes who gather every day for breakfast know about Callion's health. Maybe ask him about that," said the queen, and the king told her to stop. With a mocking tone, she says that she's only concerned. "In the midst of this chaos, our son is only getting worse." Then the king, filled with anger, draws his sword and asks how she dares to say, "Our son." Someone said that of all people, she should not be the one saying that. The queen's expression changed drastically. Planche continued, saying that Callion was fine and that he never felt there was anything wrong with him. At least that's what he noticed since the last time they met. At this, the queen became furious with Planche. Then the doors opened, and the arrival of the priest was announced. The queen took the opportunity to return to Haija Palace, and the king asked the priest to heal the prince. But when the priest began to use his magic to heal him, a protective barrier appeared around the prince. Someone arrived right behind the priest and prevented him from using his magic. It was the mage Manhwa, who arrived sweating and said, "She wants him to die." The mage then said, "Just kill him." The furious king then asked what he was doing, saying that Callion needed urgent treatment. The mage said that the prince has a circle in his heart, and if a mage's circle comes into contact with sacred power, no matter how lucky one is, the heart will explode, and the person will die. Callion was coughing a lot, writhing on the ground. The king asked, "If sacred power doesn't work, what will we do? Is it possible with magic?" The mage said that if it were a healer with the power of nature, maybe, but with magic, it's impossible. And the king told him to find a way quickly because the prince was suffering. The mage then remembered a moment in his life when he witnessed a scene that scared him greatly. A man was kneeling on the ground, bleeding from his mouth, just like Callion. The man was asking why he was in such a state. Then the mage held the prince's head. He sat on the ground, placing the prince's head on his lap. The prince looked at his master's face. With slightly blurred vision, he asked, "Why are you making that face?" Then Manhwa thought to himself that he never imagined using this spell again in this lifetime. In his mind, he recalled using the magic on that man from the past, and telling the man that this magic would remove his pain, calling him stubborn. Days go by, and people walk normally on the street. While a couple walks down the street, a leaf comes flying. It hits the man's face, startling him. Looking up at the sky, he sees that many other leaves have writing on them, asking for the truth about the Brisson family, which killed 37 people, to be revealed. Brisson found himself caught in a storm. The suspicions of the queen trying to poison Callion and the cruel acts of the Brisson family went public, causing outrage. No one could get involved with Brisson because if they made mistakes, they could be dragged into this as well. The king himself pointed to Queen Celise as guilty of the poisoning. "To think that the queen is a murderer!" The enraged people wrote on the kingdom's walls demanding the elimination of Queen Celise. Mage Manhwa said that the prince had mentioned that for the foundation of a mage troop, they needed to take advantage when Celise was in the spotlight. While the king read what seemed to be a letter from the prince, he was deep in thought. The king was surprised because Callion had the same idea as him to create a mage troop. Then, in front of Callion's bed, the queen said that the Mage Association must be quite busy. She asked when they managed to prepare something like this, hiding her face with her fan. Callion then pretended not to know, and said he had no idea what she was talking about. The prince said he could rest for quite a while thanks to her, which made her angry because, for someone who hovered between life and death, he was doing quite well. He continued, saying that he almost crossed over to the other side. Panting and sweating heavily, he says that because of this, it will be difficult for them to have a long conversation. "If there's nothing else to say, I will go rest," concluded the prince. The queen, with her nerves on edge, asks what he thinks about them negotiating one by one. Callion replies that she should have said that a week ago and that the circumstances have changed now. But he says he will listen to what she has prepared to say. The queen then says that if he states that the accusations are not true, she will not object to what he has prepared. The prince bursts into laughter at what she said and replies that he thinks she is misunderstanding, while the queen hides her angry face behind the fan. The young man says that he doesn't need something like the queen's permission and asks if she has nothing else to do there. The queen grips her fan in anger. She then stands up, pointing her finger at Kalyan, and tells him to say what he wants. With a smile on his face, he says that in a land where the descendants of Sespanian reign, how can the sound of swords be so loud? He concludes by saying that he wants to disband Pable's knight troops. This leaves the queen utterly shocked, and she asks if he wants to disband all of them. Pable, the royal knights given to Celise by Marquis Brisson. Losing them means Celise will lose half of her power. Kalyan tells her to dissolve Pable and begin the foundation of a mage troop, and that there are no other options. The queen is infuriated by what he is demanding. The prince then calls for his servant, who brings some documents and hands them to the queen. Here is the testimony bearing the oath seal, says Ian, handing the paper to the astonished queen. She is surprised because of the oath seal, and the prince explains that it is a magic that engraves the contents of the contract into each other's hearts, and that if the oath is broken, the heart is destroyed, and death follows. Queen Celise visited Kalyan as soon as he woke up. Meanwhile, the first prince was tending to the roses in his garden. He observed a fallen rose on the ground and became very thoughtful, recalling the moment when Kalyan collapsed. Their eyes had met just moments before he fainted. He also remembered his brother's comment at breakfast that the roses would bloom soon, and then knew Kalyan wanted to involve him in this. He was curious to see how these roses would bloom, so he was thinking about acting according to Kalyan's wishes. At the moment the prince collapsed, Randall was about to speak up, but Planche did so first, saying that Kalyan had been fine before. Randall was surprised because it was Planche who stepped in to help the prince. He knew that something was definitely changing. Back in Kalyan's room, he was explaining to the queen how the oath worked. It was a magic that engraves the contents of the contract into each other's hearts, and if the oath is violated, the heart is destroyed, and the person dies immediately. Given that the trust in our relationship is not very strong, said the prince, he asks what the queen is going to do, and she just remains silent as if in shock. The queen grabs the pen from Kalyan's servant's hand, and begins to sign the oath. As she signs, a magic aura starts to appear. The magic envelopes her arm as she finishes signing. Then the contract is completed, linking their hearts in a chain. The queen throws the pen on the ground angrily and breaks it. As she turns to leave, Kalyan tells her not to misunderstand. He continues, saying that he never had a good relationship with his brothers, and that on that fateful day when he was poisoned, Planche didn't intervene for his sake, and if she had said one more word at that moment, the king's sword would have cut off her head immediately. In Celise's mind, only the image of Planche appears. She seems surprised by Kalyan's words. Regaining her composure as an empowered woman, she leaves Prince Kalyan's room quickly, and he just watched her go. Some time later, the mage goes to the prince's room and says he was shocked to learn that Celise had visited him. Someone is apparently devouring many bananas. The mage feels more at ease because it seems Kalyan is just very hungry, and Kalyan says that the bananas are delicious while devouring one. The mage says that he barely survived, so anything he eats will be delicious, and the prince, smiling, says he did his part. Manisil is indignant that he can smile because he could literally be visiting the prince's grave right now. He says that if it weren't for the elf siblings who appeared at that exact moment, and that they were lucky the girl named Hina is a healer who deals with the power of nature. While the mage says he could have died, the prince is surprised because he didn't know that Hina was a healer. Manisil asks if he didn't know this in his previous life, and the young man says that back then, he only had ties with Kairi. When he met him, she was already gone. The mage then got answers without even asking anything, and he is furious at Kalyan for taking the poison without any plan to survive the situation, relying only on the power of the blessing. While Kalyan apologizes, the mage threw a paper at him. They were the identification certificates for the children he had asked for earlier, and the prince had almost forgotten about them. Then something catches the prince's attention and surprises him. The names of the two siblings bore the surname Burin. The mage said they needed a surname, so he took his former name since it didn't seem like he brought them here by coincidence. While looking at the certificate very carefully, Kalyan smiles and thanks the mage. He then says they aren't fake, it's legitimate identification, and that the mage made sure they were registered as people from Burin's territory from the beginning. The mage says that it was Romain who did that, which surprises the prince. Manisil asks how he feels now that rumors of being the king's favorite son are starting to spread. Kalyan asks if these rumors really exist, and the mage says that since the king acted that way in front of all the nobles, of course there would be rumors. The prince feels conflicted and says that it's something someone else should have felt. He sits on the sofa, deeply reflecting on the entire situation. Kalyan calls Ian to clear the banana peels from the table. His servant calls him and stands in front of him, looking at him. He says that he has something to tell the prince, who asks what it is. Ian says that he wants to stop being his assistant. Such words left the prince very astonished because he didn't expect any of it. A small child's foot on the carpet. The boy is running through a magnificent palace hall flanked by thick columns. In the background, on the left side of the second floor, he runs to where he wants to go, looks behind the wooden railing, and shouts loudly that he is there. In front of him, a severely ill man is lying in bed. We can see his hand wrapped in bandages. The boy, with a smile on his face, says hi to his brother, and in a low voice, his brother replies hi back. "Did you hear the crickets calling this morning?" the boy asks his brother. "Crickets, yes. When summer begins, those horrible black insects start screaming like crazy," the man responds gloomily. The boy, more optimistic, says that crickets have very strange wings, but maybe they make loud noises inside themselves with their stomachs. He suggests catching one of those insects tomorrow morning and bringing it here. The brother, covered in bandages from head to toe, says he shouldn't do that and mentions that he doesn't like crickets, asking him to just play his violin instead. "I heard that your son is quite good in medicine," says the man. "He said he was busy with something else. How could I ask him for this?" Disturbing phrases reach the boy's ears. "But sir, this really hurts me too. But there must be another way," says another man. "I didn't know at the time how the phrase, 'someone who cannot have something and cannot have that,' would be so horrifying." "Siloyen," the brother calls the boy. "Don't look away. Look me in the eyes. Understand that I am dying," said his brother, staring intensely at him. Loud screams are heard. "We need to escape," they were shouting. "Take Siloyen and get him out of here. The fire is spreading fast." That's how my brother, the day before his 15th birthday, decided to rid himself of his suffering and that of everyone else. After that day, summer passed, autumn came and was replaced by winter. Then the crickets started calling again in the garden, and he shut himself off more and more. His father, who couldn't bear to see him suffer, took him out of the room. He would always try to lock himself in his arms, his head resting on his shoulder. "What kind of boy is this?" he suddenly asked. "This is the third prince of our kingdom." Head bowed between his hands, he was grieving. A young man with red eyes was incredibly sad. Soroyan sees that the prince's heart is very heavy. "I wanted to resign from being your servant," says Ian timidly, looking at Kolyan. He looks at him in shock. "No, what are you talking about?" he asked. Ian, sobbing loudly, begins to tell the story. She was the person closest to the prince, but she didn't understand what was happening. Not only that, but she was the one bringing the poison every morning. Looking at his shocked servant, "It was my fault because I ignored the things that bothered me, and I couldn't even stay by your side when you were in danger. I didn't know anything, and once again, you almost died," says Ian. Ian sees the face of his dead brother. "Don't ignore the fact that I'm dying," he says as if from beyond and reaches out his hands to Ian. "Ian, look at me," shouted the prince quickly. His servant then opens his tear-filled eyes as if he has awakened, and his highness then asks who is standing before him now. I can see by the look in his eyes that he is waiting for an answer. Ian, crying, says that it is Prince Kolyan. Kolyan then, placing his hand on Ian's chest, says that he is not going to die. "From the very first time I opened my eyes here, you were there for me, and only thanks to you have I endured up to this moment. I survived because you took care of me. It seems that I also don't know much about you, but I am certain of one thing. You will continue to protect me from now on, won't you?" asked the prince to Ian. This made his servant begin to cry, deeply moved. He fell to his knees, weeping. "Stop this now and stand up," shouted the prince. Ian thinks he won't be able to return anymore. The prince extends his hand to help him up. "There is a person here whom I must protect for the rest of my life," Ian thought. He says that he will get rid of the people who made him suffer. Kolyan asks what he is talking about and if he intends to take revenge. Ian replies that yes, because it hurt him. So Kolyan asks him to stop and says that elephants must remain still, or a war will start. Ian says to forget about the war, even if he is not acting under the Siegfried family's identity. The prince called him an elephant. Ian, shocked, asks if he knew, and Kolyan shrugs and smiles. Ian asks since when, and Kolyan responds vaguely. Ian says that it's not something Kolyan should know and adds that he hates his father. Kolyan responds that once he's done getting rid of the banana peels, he wants some coffee. Then Kolyan asks Ian if they should bet on whether Ian will grow taller than him or not. In a dream, Baron sees Kolyan. They stood face to face with each other. Kolyan had a calm smile, while Baron looked astonished. Kolyan then approaches Baron. He gets very close, still smiling, and then walks past Baron quickly. Baron watched Kolyan moving towards two other people. They seemed to be friends for a long time. Kolyan then looks at Baron, who is very frightened by all of this. Baron reaches out his hand towards Kolyan, who removes the smile from his face and looks surprised. He then smiles again, now with a confident look. Kolyan says something that wakes Baron up. Then, with a smile on his face, Kolyan watches Baron as if he were falling. Baron then plunges down, and Kolyan merely observes. Baron wakes up from the dream and is still in Kolyan's body. He sits up in bed, not quite understanding what happened in the dream. While conducting a funeral for the previous Kolyan, Manisil asks if he truly passed away in the end. Cullion responds that he thought the other Cullion might have wanted to experience what he longed for before leaving, but he was in such a hurry that he ended up departing. Cullion says that he will live this life for him and ensure that he achieves what he desires. Cullion remarks that if this life was like chains for that child, he is a bit envious of his complete freedom. He tells Maniso that he won't pretend to be unaware. There are many things he has started and the favors he's been asked for. He will live his second life properly. The Papal Knight Corps was quickly dissolved and returned to Marquis Brisson. Romain stated not to believe the baseless rumors about the royal family. Elon announced that he would create a mage corps. 3 months later, Ian and the maid mention they need to call the tailor. Ian tells her to inform them that there are many clothes that need mending and that the current clothes are too small. Cullion enters the room where Romain and Elon are. Romain tells Cullion that he seems to have grown even more since the last time he saw him and comments that Cullion looks even taller than Planche. The king asks if Cullion has finished preparing for Rosalita. Cullion responds that he's completed everything since his birthday is approaching. Maniso mentions that there is someone he needs to introduce to Cullion, and that's why he was summoned. He will be the mage who will be his guardian for Rosalita. The man enters the room and says it is an honor to meet him, introducing himself. It is Arsene Hertz. Cullion is horrified at the sight of him. Romain says that he is a talented figure who will be part of the mage corps, and hopes they will learn and become closer along the way. Cullion responds angrily that it is quite unexpected, and that it's a very special birthday gift. Cullion asks when the mage corps will be formed, and Elon replies that it won't be anytime soon, as they don't even have a name, nor the number of people, nor a uniform. Nothing is confirmed, and there is still a long way to go. It's just the beginning, says Elon while Hertz smiles at the prince. Elon asks Romain if he would like to name the mage corps, and Romain seems to have something in mind as he has been thinking about it for a while. With a smile, Romain suggests the name Valkan. Prince Cullion appears to like the name as well. Elon says it's almost as if Romain had been waiting to be asked, and it would have been an issue if he hadn't been. Cullion asks what Hertz thinks. Holding his teacup, the prince waits for his answer with a smile, and Hertz asks about what specifically. Cullion says it's about the name Valkan, and whether he likes it or if it is familiar. Elon then looks at Cullion and Hertz. With a smile on his face, Hertz says it's a good name. Elon creates a barrier and is shocked to hear about the past relationship between Cullion and Hertz, asking if he should withdraw his recommendation. Cullion says there's no need. Elon comments that if it's as Cullion says, and the prince confirms that Hertz is the one who killed him. He knows that Hertz is different from the past, just as the situation is. However, he still feels it's wrong to let things go so easily. Meanwhile, Hertz is trembling somewhere. Cullion goes to Poland, who greets him. Cullion says it's been a while and tells him to relax. He apologizes for hiding his name and for appearing without notice. Poland says he is extremely honored that the prince came to seek him out. Cullion has never aligned himself with nobles until now, and the fact that he visited in secret was out of consideration for the eyes that might be watching. Cullion says he won't speak in circles and will get straight to the point. He's there to collect his reward for saving Poland's life. He asks what the Poland Emporium would like to negotiate. Poland responds that he recently began officially trading diamonds and is even exchanging horses with the imperial family. But that's not the answer Cullion wants. Poland admits he doesn't have something to trade yet. Cullion simply smiles, looking at the Baron, and asks if he's capable of managing something beyond the Emporium. Poland replies that if he has employees and funds, it won't be a problem. Cullion states that he has the staff and the money, but so does Brisson. Poland then says that he thought he had Cullion. The two fall silent for a short moment. Cullion starts laughing, saying that he's right, they do have him too. Poland remarks that if they had as much money as Cullion right in front of them, Brisson wouldn't be an issue. Cullion reveals they are planning to create a mage corps and have enough money and people, but the problem is management. Poland then asks if this is the price of his life. Cullion just smiles at him, and says that he's already received it, and that the price of his life is that. This makes Poland a bit frightened, but he agrees to do it promptly. The prince then thinks that his plan has worked. He was supposed to die after his 15th birthday, but he changed his fate before that. And now he has people he trusts by his side. What remains is to find the will of Sisfanian in his Rosalita. He wonders why all of this is happening. Then, arriving at his birthday party, Cullion admires the celebration that was made for him, noting that everything turned out perfectly. Planche is leaning against one of the pillars in the hall. The prince walks over to speak with him. Smiling, he approaches Planche and greets him, saying it's been a while since they last saw each other. But Planche doesn't pay him any mind, so the prince simply walks past him. Planche calls him Bloody Eyes. Cullion looks back, and the second prince is standing there with his usual carefree demeanor. The third prince says he won't let this pass any longer, and that his name is Cullion. With a smile, Planche asks, Cullion? He then says that he's not Cullion. This shocks the young prince. Planche continues, saying that he rides horses, uses swords, and even talks back to others. Then, approaching Kullian quickly, he asks who he really is. Kullian is very taken aback by the question. He then thinks that he cannot forget that he's no longer the king of Secretia, that he lost his homeland to Planche, and that this is not the mad king who destroyed Secretia. So, he concludes, deciding it's better to wait until he obtains the will of Sisfanian. With a smile on his face, he tells Planche that he's saying strange things, and keeps smiling at the second prince, who only looks at him with anger. Sometime later, the mage, talking to the prince, says that if it's Planche, it makes sense that he would notice, because even though he's a scoundrel, he's not an idiot. The young man looks at the mage with a confused expression. He asks, "Planche is a scoundrel?" And the mage replies that yes, and it's not a surprise. The prince then gives a slight smile, and says that's how he sees him. He adds that he pretended not to understand but obviously didn't believe it, and asks what they will do to make him believe, because the prince himself said he is no one other than Kullian. He says the mage is right, and completes by saying that he really said that, while the mage watches him thoughtfully. Even though he said he wouldn't live as Baron, it's not that easy to forget, the mage thought. Then he catches the young prince's attention and hands him a ring. He says that if he ever needs an old man to talk to, he'll be there to listen. Kullian asks if the ring has some kind of communication magic. The mage says yes, that he put a bit of his power in it, and told him it can't be used in places with Sisfanian power like the castle, but he will always respond when he can. The prince thanks him and says he likes feeling connected to his master. Manisil asks what is troubling him, and says that all the people there are good people. With a smile on his face, his apprentice asks if he really thinks that's the case. Sometime later, a man introduces himself, saying he is Commander Uran, leader of the Siegfried Knights. He continues, saying that his knights will protect him until they arrive. The Sisfanian nest is located within the Siegfried territory. Ironically, the prince thinks that this is to be expected from the Siegfried Knights. He hadn't imagined it would be so impressive. Ian, his servant, was the eldest son and young master of the Siegfried family. He asks if His Highness needs anything before they leave. Placing a hand on his shoulder, the prince replies that he needs something to drink. When Ian asks if water will suffice, the knights seem furious. The servant then says that if he doesn't want water, a cup of tea would do, and the prince agrees. Ian goes to get it while His Highness thanks him. The prince then turns his gaze to the knights. He simply smiles while looking at them, and the knights seem enraged that he's giving orders to Ian. Meanwhile, Manisil, Kyrie, and Hina are just astonished by the prince's demeanor, and the mage wonders why he's making enemies for no reason. This is a unique opportunity to witness the will of Sigmund Khan Sisfanian. The entire kingdom is celebrating Kallian's birthday. Everyone is watching the coming-of-age ceremony of the Prince of Kyrus. Even Planche was there, watching, though he didn't seem to be enjoying it much. The queen, on the other hand, wasn't there. She was drinking her tea in her chambers. The prince then parades on his horse through the crowd. His gaze meets Manisil's, and the two share a smile. The prince passes through a giant door, and that's when Roselida officially began. "He's been in an accident before, so I'm worried. Wouldn't it be better if you accompanied him?" asked the king. Calmly, the mage responded that there was nothing to worry about and that he was more concerned about the prince inside the castle than outside of it. While setting his cup on the table, the king commented that the mage was as always, and that it wasn't a compliment. He asked if he really wasn't worried. Sighing, the mage thought that for someone with so many concerns, things had been quite different until now. Then the mage answered the king's question, saying that it's not as if what he's saying is wrong. The king then exclaims that this is exactly the part he was referring to. While riding through the forest on his horse, the prince becomes curious about how the ring works. He tries to ask some questions, but no response comes from the ring. He continues, saying he heard that deliveries from Tencel arrived and that the palace is in chaos. Ian suggests they should talk to avoid boredom. The prince says that he was responsible for the scene he's been seeing over the past few days, and is surprised by his servant, who said he's been working hard to speak with him. Ian then turns to the knights and tells them to listen, saying that Prince Kullian was declared by the mage to have no magical talent, and that in terms of swordsmanship, he knows little about self-defense. This means that he is fragile and delicate like a flower, so they should protect him very well. The knights are very disappointed because the young master, an eldest son of the Siegfried family, gave up his position as lord to stand beside this weak prince. Ian mentions that it will still take 2 or 3 more hours to reach Lalong. As he asks if they should rest, the prince hears something in the forest and interrupts him. All the knights draw their swords and pay close attention to the noise. Kyrie and the mage prepare to protect the young prince. Looking in the direction of the sound, the prince thinks they don't need to be so cautious. Then, emerging from the leaves, a creature runs out, begging for help. It was just a small, desperate elf. As Kullian asks the elf's name, and the elf says he's hungry, everyone is shocked at how kindly he treated the elf. The prince asks if he came there because he wanted something to eat, and what he was doing there, and the elf says he was hiding. The little elf seemed to be very scared. The prince knew that there was something odd about this conversation. One of the knights asks what they should do, and Kalyan says that they need to give the elf some food. Then the young man hears a noise coming from the middle of the trees. He then turns in the direction of the sound and says that the elf should have said earlier if someone was following him. Then a man emerges from the trees riding his horse. The prince removes his cloak and wraps it around the little elf girl, and tells Kairi to hide her with him. One of the knights steps forward and asks who the man who just arrived is. The man says he was chasing a thief and asks if they had seen a strange child. But the knight replies that they haven't seen such a child and tells him to leave. He then notices that Kairi was hiding someone and says he's not there to fight knights. He just came to find someone and asks if they'll let him look around, as many lights appear in the forest. The knight is about to respond, but the prince interrupts and asks what the person he's looking for looks like. The man then says it's a young elf. At that moment, Kalyan gives him permission to check if there's anything there, leaving the young elf very frightened that the prince allowed him to search. The man starts walking toward Kairi, who is hiding the elf. As he passes by the young man, Kalyan tells him not to turn around and just listen. The prince says that those behind him, who came accompanying him, won't protect him, and their target is him and the child. The moment he checks the child's identity, arrows will come from that direction. Before the prince finishes his sentence, the man turns around. When he turns, the man sees the glow in the forest increasing. Countless arrows are shot in the man's direction, but all the arrows are broken before reaching their target. The prince had saved the man with his sword and knocked him to the ground to get him out of the line of fire. Kalyan then tells the man that he had told him not to turn around. More arrows are fired from the forest, and one of the knights shouts, "Ambush! Protect the prince!" Then Mage Hertz casts a spell that creates a shield, reflecting the arrows. While concentrating on his magic, he sees the enemies retreating, and the leader of the knights tells them to follow but not go too far. The prince then thinks that no more arrows are coming his way, so he's certain that the enemies chose to flee. The man realizes that the young prince has let down his guard, while Hertz takes the elf who is with Kairi so he can protect the young prince. Approaching him, he asks if he is alright. Then he shouts to get the prince's attention, and the man quickly starts to attack. Kairi yells to protect his back. Right after striking, the man is surprised, because the young prince, with his small dagger, managed to defend himself. After stopping the attack, the prince casts a spell that hits the man's chest, causing him great pain. The man falls to the ground, screaming desperately. All the other knights are in shock at what the prince just did. They wonder if the prince can actually use magic. Then Ian runs desperately toward the prince. He asks if the prince is alright and says that he's lucky things always end well and that they have knights. So why did he move forward? While his mind tells him that the prince only knows a little about defense and swordsmanship, and is not skilled in magic, the knights can only remember the scenes they just witnessed. And they think that this definitely isn't what the young master should have been saying. They wonder what kind of flower it is that Ian mentioned the prince was, who was able to do what he did to a person. A few minutes later, the little elf girl still seems to be scared. The prince approaches her, removing his hood, and says that they're going to talk, looking at her with a slightly more serious expression. And before he even asks what she stole, she blurts out, "Luca did it. I don't know anything." Then the elf girl keeps answering questions before the prince can even ask, saying she doesn't know who stole it, and that the scoundrel said it was her. The young man then places his hand on his head, seeming tired of it all. He then calls the mage, who quickly puts himself at his disposal, and he asks the mage to organize what the elf girl is saying for him, because it seems she's responding before he can even ask, and the mage says to leave it to him. The girl seems very happy, while the mage looks startled, and he says, "Here's your report," as he says that she works in the Heriska forest, and that her name is Silas Tianureha. The girl interjects, saying that her name means spirit of suppressed words. Then the mage continues, saying that the elf she was traveling with, Luca, seems to have stolen the item from those men who attacked them. She got separated from Luca while being chased by the men, and that's when she met the prince, and that she doesn't know why she responds before they even ask. While trying to say something, the girl interrupts the prince, saying that it's not quite like that. The prince then gives up speaking and says that the mage can handle it. The mage steps aside, and the girl follows him, and they start talking about whether she's following him. Ian asks the prince what his plans are. He responds that she'll be hunted down as soon as they separate, so they should leave her near the forest. His servant asks if he plans to resolve the situation. He says no because he has a long journey ahead, and there's no reason to get involved. He mentions that he'll leave the investigation to the nearest lord. While Ian mentions they'll arrive by dinner time, the leader of the knights asks if his highness has a minute. The knight says there's something suspicious among the man's belongings and asks if he can check. The young man asks what it is, and the knight hands him something wrapped in cloth. As he unwraps the cloth, the prince is surprised by what he sees. A bit alarmed, he asks if the man had it, and the knight replies that yes, he did, and asks if the prince knows what it is. The prince says he knows. There's no way he wouldn't. It was the same poison he had once taken. He says he needs to see the man personally. While they are talking, a man comments that he thought he was just a precious young master from a rich family. But I guess that's not all, the man concluded. Approaching the man, the prince said that he's right, and that he is an even more precious son from a wealthy family. Holding the vial of poison in his hands, the prince says he'll be brief and straightforward, and asks if the man knows what that is. The man simply looks at what he is holding, saying that all of them had one and thought it was something good, so he stole a few. The prince asks what they were looking for. The man says he's not sure, and the young man asks who they are. The man replies that he couldn't see because of the masks. Cullion asks if he remembers anything else, and the man says no. Then the prince notices something strange about him. He kneels down and says that the man doesn't seem to be covering for them because he cares. He asks what the problem is, and says he will resolve it if the man cooperates. The prince tells the man to trust him. Who knows, maybe he, the precious son of a wealthy family, can solve this. The man is astonished by the young man's attitude, and half whispering, he says that his wife is in the village of Hansen, and he knew about it. The prince says he will ensure that she is safe and asks what they lost. The man says it was a clear marble the size of a fingernail. He says he doesn't know exactly what it was, but they said the tinsel priest would need to check it to be sure. The young prince thinks that this means they had a sacred relic. Sacred relics are used by tinsel priests to substitute sacred power, and that's why tinsel is trying to obtain as many sacred relics as possible. The prince then understands why they are making such a fuss, but he wonders how they had that poison. That was the poison carried by secretion agents, used in the worst-case scenario when they failed a mission, and that's why the man had obtained it through the White Eagle. The man says he doesn't know their identities, but he heard the title by which they called their leader, and the prince asks what it was. Blue Ladybug, the man replied. The prince is startled by the name he heard. He seems to recognize this name. It was the name of one of Burns' father's birds, and he wonders what it was doing there. Later that day, already in the Lavon territory, it was raining. Inside, talking with the prince, the man says that maybe the rain was a good thing since dinner time, as it made it impossible for them to advance. Tapping his glass on the table, he said he had been waiting for this day. The man, very happy, said it was a great honor for him. That man was Count Hail Ladon, lord of the Ladon territory. The man continues, still very pleased, saying, "Let's see. At times like these, it's almost as if the heavens are telling you to serve the prince." While the young man thinks that he talks too much, he remembers the conversation he had with Ian earlier, where Ian asked if he didn't remember Count Hale. He was one of those who sent him a gift before, so he recalls that the name was on the list of donors, who received their gifts back, and his servant said yes, and that although he was originally on Prince Randall's side, he quickly switched sides to Prince Planche 6 years ago during the Great Desert and Tencel War. The prince then thinks that this is the opportunist to whom he sent the gift. The man, still very happy, keeps saying that he's been waiting for the day the prince would arrive, and the prince thinks that he must have really spoken to Planche last year. Malcolm Chadish, Count Hale's butler, appears to be quite embarrassed by the count's behavior. Hertz enters through the door, asking for permission, and says he has something to discuss with the prince. He then whispers to the young man that they captured the messenger pigeon. The prince knew they had tried to alert the blue ladybug that they were there. No other bird would fly in this rain and darkness unless it had such a purpose. Hale asks the mage where he was on such a cold day and if he'd like a drink, but the prince responds that they don't want to drink, that they want to know if there's a tinsel priest nearby. The man drops the wine bottle on the table, smiling, and apologizes, saying he seems a bit drunk. He asks what he was talking about, and if it was about the tinsel priest. The man becomes furious and asks if they're talking about those damned bastards who can't come to such a remote place. The prince calls the count's attention and tells him to calm down, but the man continues, saying that those bastards are evil and that if the prince looked closely. Before he can finish his sentence, the young man snaps his fingers and tells him to sleep. The man then collapses onto the table, fast asleep. The people in the room are startled by what the prince did, and he says he couldn't contain his anger at the man's rude behavior. Then the scene shifts to the prince riding his horse, talking to Maniso through his ring. The mage asks if he's saying he got involved with a secret item and that his life is now in danger. He goes on to say that Maniso was planning to retire, and the young man tells him not to worry too much. The mage asks how far his connections go, and the prince replies that he's someone who has never failed a mission before. He continues, saying there's no way he didn't notice it was the Prince of Kairos and wonders what kind of situation would make someone risk using an arrow as an agent. The mage then tells him to find a place near Ladlon where the tinsel priest is staying. The mage continues, saying that they need to see what the secret agent was trying to do with the priests. In a bar somewhere, a woman is cleaning glasses and cups. Then Prince Cullion enters the bar. He greets the woman and says that those outside were just following him. Setting the glass down, the woman tells him not to worry, and that she's not so cruel as to hurt those unrelated. The prince says that he thought she attacked them knowing who he was. She responds by saying that's why she told him to stay out of it. The prince then notices that everyone around him is unconscious, and the woman concludes that he was reckless. The prince walks up to the counter where the woman is and asks if now he is involved. The woman replies that she would say yes, but she looks at the young man and notices the red aura surrounding him, and the woman concludes by saying that this won't be easy. The prince gives a slight smile as he looks at the woman. She asks if the elf she was chasing is dead, and she says they lost him when he took the forest path. If I'd known it would be such a headache, I wouldn't have pursued him in the first place, the woman says. I particularly don't like this situation, but since it hasn't harmed us that much, would you go back? Asks the woman, saying that she will leave the elf child alone. The prince, picking up a glass, says that if she answers a few questions, he'll leave, and asks why she's looking for a sacred relic. Looking at her through the glass, he says that she's not a priestess. The woman then makes an angry face, snatches the glass from Kallian's hand, and says that they've become expensive lately. He says that it seems like she's selling the relics then. The woman says that her primary job usually doesn't pay well. The prince just observes the woman, and asks if the buyer of the sacred relics is in Latlan. He says there's no reason for her to sell in the countryside and that it would be easier to find priests in Kairos. The woman says that there's no one who would pay more than this buyer, and he's also someone with whom she has a bond. So the prince thought that originally there was only one type of connection that could be made, with secret agents. Someone who sells information about Kairos. And now, to pay for the information for the blue mayfly, they are buying sacred relics. The prince then noticed that she served him a little wine. Looking at the wine, he thought it would be his last question. Some distance away at the royal palace, the king asks what the wizard came to ask him and says that now he's being treated as an informant. Manhwa says he went there knowing the king would be awake and mentions that there's no reason to go through so much trouble to confirm something the king already knows. He asks how many Tencel priests were in Kairos and where. The king then says he doesn't know if the wizard is asking because he knows something or if it's just a coincidence. The representatives of Tencel came specifically because of this. Among the 14 priests, aside from the one in the palace, they wanted to find and take the rest so they wouldn't request more priests. After sending them to celebrate what they desired for so long, it's uncomfortable because they act as if Kairos is using their priests, the king says. Manhwa then says that the situation in Tencel is not good. He asks, they didn't reveal their situation, but they needed the priests. And what did the king do? The king told them to find the rest and take them. The king questions why the wizard is asking, and Manhwa says that Prince Kallian wanted to know the location of the priests. The king then finds the prince's question strange, and asks why he would ask that, when he's already arrived at the place where the priests are? Romain wonders. Back at the bar, Kallian asks the woman his question, wondering if the buyer of the relic was Count Hale Latlan. The woman, sipping her wine, says, who knows? I don't think that's such a simple question, she concludes. So the prince returns to his horse and, riding very quickly, says that the man pretended not to know. He hid the priest and acted as if he didn't know, and after buying relics at a high price, he sold information to agents of Secretia. Manhwa says that he's right, and the prince says that he should return to the castle soon. The wizard says he can sense his urgency and asks if there's a problem. Kallian says yes, because when he put him to sleep with magic at the dinner, he thinks the man wasn't drunk. Meanwhile, at the Latlan Palace, someone is shouting, saying it's disrespectful, and asks how many times he has to repeat it. It was Ian speaking to the butler, saying that the prince had gone out for a walk, and the butler says he needs to have a quick word with the prince because the count wanted to apologize for his attitude. Ian interrupts, asking if he's trying to cover up his insolence. He seems genuinely very angry about it, and he asks again, since when can a count's butler question the whereabouts of a prince? The butler becomes very frightened, and doesn't know how to respond. Ian is very thoughtful about all of this. He thinks that the prince probably hasn't returned yet. The butler asks again when the prince will be back, and Ian shouts at him, saying he can't tell him and to leave at once. Then the prince appears at the bedroom door, and asks if he can't rest. So Ian and the old butler are startled, and Kallian calls his servant incompetent. I told you to give a proper excuse and send them away. How hard can that be? He asks, surprising Ian. His servant apologizes, but the butler was very persistent, and asks to leave it to him. The prince then closes the door quite forcefully. Outside the room, the butler keeps apologizing, saying he didn't know His Highness was resting and that he will take his leave. And the prince leans against the door, relieved. And he has a slight outburst because he spoke as if he were a certain someone, and it left a bad taste in his mouth. His servant enters through the door and says that he returned earlier than expected, and through the window, no less. And the prince says it's a long story. He asks if anyone else was looking for him, or if anything suspicious happened. And Ian says just that butler from earlier. although there is a prince who uses windows as an exit, Ian concludes, recalling when His Highness left through the window despite it being the 3rd floor. Cullion chuckles lightly and says he understands. The young prince asks why Ian is so angry, and that he wasn't this upset back at the palace. And Ian replies that it's because the butler didn't listen to him. Even though he said the prince was out walking, he kept asking when you would return. Then he found it strange, and his servant said that he wouldn't stop asking, and that he seemed more interested in when the prince would return rather than where the prince had gone. Later, the prince was speaking with the wizard and said that the count already suspected they were investigating something, and he mentions that they were right to say he wasn't drunk. The wizard asks why he believes the count pretended to be drunk and acted that way. The prince replies that the date for the exchange of sacred relics with the blue mayfly is today, and that explains why the mayfly was there. The wine was just an excuse to escape unnoticed, but it failed when he put him to sleep. And when he knew that I had left the castle, he sent his butler to investigate, said the prince, and the wizard replies that he understood, but asks, why does he want a sacred relic so badly? And Cullion says he must be trying to offer it in exchange for a favor with Tencel, the homeland of Prince Randall's mother. While maintaining a relationship with Randall, he also flirts with Planche and sends secret gifts to Cullion, said the wizard. He sold information about Karis to a secret agent of Secretia. What a crafty man, said the prince. Helping Salus, who was being chased, was just the beginning. The man who was hunting her mentioned the name of the blue mayfly, and I even found out that Hale sent relics to Tencel to flatter Randall through the blue mayfly. And if everything isn't just a coincidence, the prince says the rain won't stop until tomorrow, and since he's trapped there, he'll take care of this traitor. Then, in his room, Hale breaks a glass in anger. He says he should have realized that Cullion would be a problem when he returned the gifts, and that he must have used some magic, because only enchantments can cause such a deep sleep, and his plans are in disarray because of him. Acting all arrogant just because Manisil is on his side. And how dare someone with plebeian blood think he's on the same level as the princes? Stupid Celise, why didn't she kill him before all this mess started? Hale wondered. I worked so hard to have a good relationship with the nobles. I spent a fortune on Marquis Breeson. They promised me fertile lands around Karis. But because of Cullion, things have changed, said Hale furiously. Then the butler enters the room, asking permission from the count, who throws himself onto the sofa and asks if he managed to speak with the blue mayfly. The butler says no, that may be later. Count Hale then throws a glass at his head, calling him an idiot. He asks if the butler can do anything right and mentions that it was raining, which means the half-breed will stay there again tonight. The butler, scared, asks if they should postpone the transaction, and Hale, enraged, says there's nothing to be done, and that they can't take risks with the prince and his men there. He yells at a maid to bring his clothes. Hale continues, saying he will teach Prince Cullion some manners. The next day, Cullion is sitting at the table, calmly having lunch, and Count Hale just watches the young man. He thinks Cullion is acting as if nothing is wrong. Here in Karis, the title of Count demands respect. The nobility won't stand by if they find out magic was used against me. Your royal blood won't protect you. Foolish little prince, soon you'll be begging me for forgiveness, thought Count Hale. He then apologizes to Cullion for his behavior the previous night. The prince said it's fine, and the count asks if an enchantment was used. Before he finishes his question, Cullion replies that he put him to sleep with an enchantment because he was becoming unbearable. With a smile on his face, Cullion tells him not to worry since it must have been his first time receiving a member of the royal family. He concludes by saying that the count must have been nervous. Count Hale fakes a smile on the outside, but on the inside, he is furious because Cullion acted as if it were truly the count's fault. Cullion says he was tired of investigating the person who attacked him, and the count asks if it was the man he brought along. The prince replies yes, and that they gathered a lot of information, and the count thinks he should know more about it. Before Hale can ask anything, Cullion says it was about the name of a bird, and this makes the count spit out all his wine. Then the butler, startled by this, grabs a cloth for the count. Count Hale tells the butler not to touch him because he was talking with the prince. Cullion finishes by saying that he needs to look deeper into the details, but he thought the count would like to know what happened in his land. The count stands up and says that he will help with that because he won't allow a prince to be attacked on his own lands. Do you think I will let you mess with my lands? Just wait and see. I'll dig deep into this and find your weakness, thought the count. One of the knights arrives and asks to speak with his highness. Watching the knight whisper to the prince, the count thinks that he needs to send him out of his territory. The prince interrupts the count's thoughts, saying that the message was meant for the count, leaving him surprised. Smiling, he says that the man wanted to speak with him. They then go to a place that looks like a prison. The count is furious that Cullion has taken him to a place like that, and the young prince thinks that he must be feeling exactly that, but everything was already prepared for him to take the bait. Then, on the previous night, in that same place, The man behind the bars asks if something happened to his wife. He's told that his family is fine and reminded that a promise was made that nothing would happen to them. The man asks why the prince is there, and he replies that the man probably already knows that by now, the man is going to be executed. He had attempted an assault on a member of the royal family, and as soon as the investigation is concluded, he'll be taken to Karis, and it will be the end. And even if he was spared, he wouldn't get proper treatment, his arm would become necrotic, and he would die, said the prince. The man then asks what the prince is trying to say with that. Kalyan then says that he can provide him a way out. The man is surprised, and the prince continues, saying that he could live far from this territory in a place where he could live peacefully. But only if you help me. In exchange, I will make sure your punishment is limited to the amputation of your arm. The man then shows a fearful expression. The prince just maintains his serious gaze. He agrees with the prince and asks what he must do. Then, returning to the present moment, the man said that he asked the count to come because the mayfly is a secret agent from Secretia, and that she is there to sell some goods to her client, with whom she's apparently been meeting for a long time. The prince then says that it's strange because a relationship only lasts if it's with a double agent. A great treacherous traitor selling information. Don't you agree, Count? Asked the prince, concluding his words. The count appeared desperate with all of that, and could barely speak. Then Kalyan just waited for the count to make his move and give him the evidence he needed. Later, at the palace, the butler is kneeling in front of the prince, asking for forgiveness, saying that everything he did was following his master's orders, and that he's not claiming innocence but is begging for forgiveness. And the butler thought that he knew Count Lavon would be caught but didn't expect this outcome. Then the prince, deep in thought, asks the butler if he was a tinsel priest, and this leaves the butler shocked. He continues by saying that he must be the one buying and selling the relics. And the reason he's acting so submissive to Count Lavon must be because the Count discovered one of his secrets. The butler then says that if it's discovered that he's selling the relics, Tencel will have his head as soon as he returns. Kalyan is then surprised to find out that he sells the relics. So, he wasn't trying to buy them? He wondered. He then asked the butler to whom he had sold the relics. The butler responds by saying that it was to Queen Celeste's elder brother, Viscount Renan Breeson. He's gifting the sacred relics to Tencel, said the butler. Renan Breeson established a connection with Tencel. That means he betrayed Planche and took Randall's side. So he turned his back on Celeste and the rest of his own family, the Breeson family, who wanted Planche as heir. Speaking with the wizard Manisil, the prince says that the trap he set to catch the count caught something much bigger. And the wizard asks what he's planning to do next. He says it's something that will cause a great stir and asks if they should discuss it with Romaine for now, and the wizard agrees. Kalyan asks that before they do that, he should write a letter to be sent to Count Hale Lavon. The prince told his servants to treat the arm of the man imprisoned underground. The wound was severe, so it would take a long time to heal. It was better to amputate it, and after that, he told them to give him this to eat, showing the poison. The knight confirms and says he will inform him, telling Kyrie to go to Hansen village and find the man's wife to take her to a safe place. And as soon as he takes the medicine, the prince was interrupted by the young elf running into his room, saying that she came with Hina even without permission. Before he could ask, she responds that she's saying this so he doesn't get angry with Hina. The girl then runs toward the little bird, and the prince thinks that it's not his problem. She goes to the little bird and starts playing with it. And Ian asks the prince what he plans to do with the pigeon, if he'll take it along, and Kalyan says no. You're thinking about when to return it to its owner, he concludes. Hina then also starts playing with the pigeon. Kalyan and Ian just watch her. Then the prince says that he will give her a bird when they return to the palace, because he needs to return that bird tonight. Hina tries to say that Merlin might not like having a bird in their room, and the prince just smiles and says it's a pity. He asks her to help him release the bird as soon as he finishes dinner, and tells her not to forget to open the window too, and she seems confused. The prince then says that he's expecting a guest. A few hours later, everyone had left His Highness's room. Only he remained there, reading his book, and he hears a noise coming from the window. Closing his book, he says that the person arrived earlier than expected. Then the visitor says that they were very moved by the contents of the letter. The letter said that if she didn't want her actions to be reported to Neolangsha, she should come and meet him. It was the blue mayfly who had arrived, and she asks why he's threatening her. The prince, pulling out a paper from the middle of his book, says he has evidence that Hale is negotiating relics and selling information. And as soon as you give them to me, I'll keep your secret. The woman just remains silent, staring at him, and he asks if that was her response, and she answers yes. She said she hates complicated relationships. She then throws several magical projectiles in his direction. The prince is startled to see magical orbs coming at him. While creating a magical barrier to protect himself, he thinks that in the past, the woman used a sword. Then all the projectiles are repelled, hitting the walls and making noise. The knights outside become agitated because there's an intruder in the prince's room. Kalyan locks the door and tells them not to come in. He asks the woman if she really came with the intent to kill him, and if there's anything else. The woman charges at him, saying there's nothing else. She draws her sword and lunges at the prince, who blocks her attack. He knew that the common iron sword he had wouldn't hold up against her aura. He needed to end that battle quickly without using his aura. The prince then manages to land a strike on the woman, but she quickly raises her sword to defend herself. At that point, the prince succeeds in disarming her, but just when he least expected it, she still had one more magical orb to attack him with. She throws the orb at him. It was too fast to block without aura, so he envelopes his sword with aura, and manages to cut the magical orb in half. But because of this, his sword couldn't withstand it and breaks. Seeing that he was able to slice the magical orb in half, the woman asks if he is a sword master. The two remain silent, and the prince wonders what he should do. Then he calls her by her real name, Isla, which leaves the woman very shocked. When she is about to ask how he knows her name, the prince grabs her face firmly. While the woman asks what he is doing, the prince opens her mouth, and looking inside her mouth, he says that the poison that should have been there is not present. Then Kalyan tells her to speak about what she knows. The woman asks if he will let her go if she tells him. "I heard Sacristians are determined people, but I don't think that's the case with you," said Kalyan. In his thoughts, the prince wasn't sure if she was always like this or if she became this way, and the woman says it's better to let her go. The woman continues, saying that a sword master is carrying a sword worse than those of the guards, as if trying to hide his abilities. "If you don't want to get caught, send me away. Otherwise, I'll tell the knights outside what I just saw," said Isla. In the other timeline, the blue mayfly was loyal to Sacritia, a sword master dedicated to her blade. "This wasn't you," thought the prince. Then, grabbing her by her shirt, the prince said, "If you go this far to beg me not to die, you shouldn't have died in front of me." The woman is startled by the prince's words, and the two remain silent. He releases her clothing and tells her not to expect anything. It's not a big enough secret to be worth trading for your life, and he tells her to reveal a piece of evidence, and then he won't interrogate her. The prince mentions that the questioning will be conducted by the White Eagle, and that frightens the woman. Not far from there, a man curses loudly. It was Count Hale, wondering where Malcolm had gone since he hadn't seen him until now. He asked what happened and what that letter was. In the letter, it said that the Count would need someone to represent him. "I explained to Queen Celise exactly what you've been selling up until now, so rest assured, there's nothing to worry about." The letter was written by Elon Manisil. The Count wonders if the wizard knows about the sacred relics. Hale says that if he sent the letter, he probably already knows. "And who does the wizard think he is to threaten me? It's annoying how I have to bow down to that damned commoner prince. He must be thinking I would come trembling to him, but he shouldn't have underestimated me. He thinks I didn't make any preparations beforehand," said Count Hale, and then he enters a room filled with treasures. Looking at it, he thinks he could have gathered more. Walking up to the vault, he says it doesn't matter, because he has something much more valuable. He opens a small box that is packed with relics, and he says that with so many relics, he could obtain a great fortune. And as he's saying what he intends to do, Hertz begins to appear behind him. When the Count goes to close the box, it disappears from his hand. He then looks back and sees the box in Hertz's hand and is startled. He asks if that was invisibility magic. Hertz nods and says that he is Prince Kalyan's wizard. He says that he is very grateful because the Count found the evidence with his own hands. And he tells him not to worry because he will make sure to inform that wily wizard and that damned commoner prince. The wizard then took the sacred relics to Kalyan. He says that he also brought all the papers with leaked information about Karis and the relic trade conducted by Hale. The prince, with a smile on his face, thanks the wizard, saying that thanks to him, the mess is almost resolved. Ian opens the door frantically, calling for the prince, telling him to look outside. Then knights dressed in golden armor approach. It was a large fleet of men mounted on their horses. The prince, while looking out the window, says that those were the personal knights of King Kala. He wonders what knights who should be protecting the king and Karis are doing there. Our video ends here. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe to the channel. Until next time, bye bye.